Chapter 40:28. While flying over several continents, Ji Tianxing released his divine perception to observe the situation on the continent. The continents, divine nations, and countless cities were as calm and peaceful as usual. There was no sign of an impending storm, nor was there any sign of danger lurking in every corner, nor was there any sign of panic. The billions of non-human beings were not on guard or aware of the impending danger. It was as usual. Seeing such a scene, Ji Tianxing was a little confused and vigilant. However, after thinking about it for a while, he understood. His first reaction was, why were the non-human beings on the heavenly policy planet unaware of the impending danger? Could it be that the God Emperor did not inform the heavenly policy region lord? Did the region lord not give any orders for the heavenly policy planet's citizens to be on guard or to deploy their defensive forces? However, Ji Tianxing thought again. If the Star Cloud God Emperor had informed the heavenly policy region lord, in order not to cause panic and unrest, the region lord would definitely take action secretly or flee. Therefore, the ordinary citizens would not know the truth. Only God Kings were qualified to know the inside story. If the non-human beings knew about the impending danger, the heavenly policy planet might experience a drastic change. The citizens would be uneasy and unrest would occur. At that time, the region lord's orders would be hard to pass down, and no plan would be able to be implemented. Of course, even if this speculation was reasonable, it was still just a speculation. Ji Tianxing would only know the truth after entering the heavenly policy divine abode. Half a day later, Ji Tianxing arrived at the central region of the heavenly policy continent. In front of him was an endless mountain range covered by a lush forest. Fog rose above the forest, and clouds rolled in the sky. This place was exceptionally rich in spirit qi, but it was shrouded in clouds all year round. Therefore, it was very mysterious. This mountain range was hundreds of thousands of miles wide, and the terrain was very high. It was the ancestor of the heavenly policy continent's dragon veins. The heavenly policy region lord's cave abode was in the depths of this mountain range. Normally, this area was a forbidden area of the heavenly policy continent. No one dared to trespass. Therefore, countless demonic beasts and spirit beasts lived in this resource-rich mountain range. When Ji Tianxing flew the warship over the mountain range, he did not forget to use his spiritual sense to investigate the situation in the mountain range. He thought to himself that the birds and beasts in the mountains would not lie. Whether the region master of the heavenly strategies region was on guard or not, or whether he was plotting something, could be seen from the reactions of the birds and beasts. Unknowingly, an hour had passed. The god-slaying battleship also reached the depths of the mountain range and arrived at the entrance of the heavenly strategies divine residence. During this time, Ji Tianxing had traversed over 200,000 miles of mountain range. His divine senses detected that everything was normal in the mountain range. Countless birds and beasts were also unaffected. They continued to roam and move about as usual. This led Ji Tianxing to a conclusion. The birds and beasts in this mountain range aren't frightened, which means that there haven't been a large number of God King experts gathered here recently. This means that the heavenly strategy divine abode did not summon an army or God King experts to reinforce them. This conclusion was further verified when he saw the situation at the entrance of the heavenly policy divine abode. Although the heavenly policy divine abode sounded like a mansion, it was actually a cave abode within the secret realm. There was a large array at the entrance of the secret realm. It was built on the peak of a giant mountain that was 3,000 feet tall. The mountain peak with a radius of 10 miles had been flattened, and a plaza had been built. In the middle of the plaza was a sacrificial altar. The large array was in a closed state. The sacrificial altar was guarded by close to 100 divine sovereign guards. The two guards at the front were low-level god kings. These guards were like statues. They did not move an inch as they guarded the sacrificial altar. Their expressions were calm and solemn. The cave abode of a stellar region master only had so few guards. This level of strength was normal. It could even be said that the defensive power was slightly weak. From this, it could be seen that the heavenly policy divine abode did not strengthen its defensive power. It seemed like the guards were still in the dark. Ji Tianqing secretly observed for a while. He realized that these guards were not pretending to be calm. They really did not know that danger was coming. This made him feel more at ease. He thought to himself, it seems like Dao Xingyun has really given up on the Heavenly Policy Region Master. In that guy's eyes, the Heavenly Policy Region Master's life is not even worth his incarnation. Ji Tianqing had originally planned to hide near the entrance and wait patiently for a while. When someone entered the secret realm, he would turn into dust and sneak into the Heavenly Policy Divine Abode. He did not expect to see no one enter or exit the Heavenly Policy Divine Abode after waiting for an entire day. Moreover, the large array at the entrance had been closed. It seemed like very few people entered or exited normally. This was normal. After all, the Heavenly Policy Star region had been peaceful for many years. Usually, there were no major events. Even if the Stellar Lords had something to report, they only needed to send a message. They did not need to personally rush to the Heavenly Policy Divine Abode. Therefore, Ji Tianqing decided not to wait any longer. He chose to take the initiative to attack. Since Dao Xingyun had already given up on the Heavenly Policy Divine Abode, he had nothing to worry about. He could wipe out the entire Heavenly Policy Divine Abode with his own strength. Swoosh! Ji Tianqing, who had been hiding and observing, suddenly appeared. He waved his hands and created a divine light that filled the sky, forming a sealing divine array. A golden light barrier with a radius of 5 kilometers descended from the sky and enveloped the entire mountain peak, sealing the plaza. The sudden change startled all the guards. They subconsciously tightened their grip on their Kenshin weapons. The 2 God King Guard commanders even held their swords in front of them. They were on high alert as they searched for the enemy. However, Ji Tianqing had openly appeared in the middle of the plaza. There was no need for them to search for him. In an instant, everyone's gazes were focused on him. Who dares to behave so atrociously in the Heavenly Policy Divine Abode? Everyone, attack together and punish him. The 2 guard commanders sensed Ji Tianqing's strength and aura. They knew that he was a God King expert. Of course, they did not dare to underestimate him. As the 2 of them shouted and gave the order, close to 100 guards brandished their swords and sabers and surrounded Ji Tianqing. At this moment, Ji Tianqing's divine consciousness moved. The sealing divine array started to operate, releasing a powerful suppressive force. In an instant, the close to 100 guards felt as though they were stuck in a quagmire. It was difficult for them to move. Even the 2 guard commanders were suppressed to the point that their backs were bent. The circulation of their divine power was very sluggish. Ji Tianqing's figure flashed and rushed into the crowd. His left and right hands sent out sword lights that filled the sky, slashing into the crowd. Following a series of muffled bangs, the close to 100 God Monarch guards fell like wheat being cut down. Most of the guards were killed with a single strike. The sword lights pierced through their heads and godheads. They died on the spot. Only a few guards were slashed by a few sword lights. Their heads were separated from their bodies, and divine blood sprayed everywhere. The sounds of bodies falling to the ground were endless. In less than 10 breaths of time, close to 100 guards were all dead. Corpses littered the ground. The 2 guard commanders were just about to attack when they saw that all the guards had been killed. Moreover, they were also covered in blood. They were scared silly on the spot. They had guessed that Ji Tianqing was very strong, but they did not expect him to be this strong. Chapter 40-29. Ji Tianqing did not wait for the 2 guard commanders to come back to their senses, nor did he give them a chance to escape. He waved his hand and shot out a few more sword lights. Swish! Bam! Bam! The sound of sword lights piercing through the air rang out as 6 sword lights successfully pierced through the heads of the 2 guard commanders. Blood splattered everywhere as the 2 guard commanders died on the spot. Their corpses fell backward and lay at the bottom of the altar. In less than 20 breaths of time, all the guards in the plaza had been killed. Ji Tianqing did not have the time to clean up the battlefield, much less to collect the spoils of war. He stepped onto the altar and used his God's eye mystic technique to observe the divine array on the altar. In a short while, he figured out the trick and activated the divine array. Swish! The altar lit up with a dazzling white light and condensed into a 30-meter-tall light door. He stepped through the white light door and instantly disappeared as he entered the mystic realm. The mystic realm was not big, only about 200,000 miles in radius. However, the mystic realm's environment was very good. There were green mountains and clear waters, flowers and trees, and the spirit qi was very abundant. The most important thing was that Ji Tianqing flew through the sky. Everywhere he went was very quiet and peaceful. During his flight, Ji Tianqing even encountered a group of patrolling guards. The 10 guards were neither fast nor slow. They looked relaxed and natural, without any sense of urgency. Ji Tianqing was invisible and had restrained his aura. He was not discovered when he passed by them. From the current situation, the Heavenly Strategy Region Lord was still unaware. The Heavenly Strategy Divine Abode also did not have any defensive measures. Ji Tianqing believed that this operation would be very successful. He flew for about 100,000 miles and arrived at the depths of the mystic realm. He saw a mountain range with many palaces and buildings built on top of it. The palaces with a radius of 1,000 miles should be the residence of the Heavenly Strategy Region Lord. Therefore, he quietly landed in the palaces and extended his divine sense to cover the entire palaces. He wanted to find out the location of the Heavenly Strategy Region Lord and then catch him by surprise and capture him. More than 20,000 people lived in this palace complex. The majority were Divine Lord realm experts. There were also more than 30 Divine King powerhouses. Ji Tianqing would be more than happy to capture the Heavenly Strategy Region Master without alerting those God Kings. After all, it would save him time and effort. However, he did not expect that when he released his divine consciousness to search for the whereabouts of the Heavenly Strategy Region Master dozens of miles ahead, at the peak of the most majestic mountain, an abnormally powerful divine aura suddenly appeared. That was the aura fluctuation of a peak divine king. No, it was several times stronger than a peak divine king, and it even carried a trace of the Tao. Ji Tianqing immediately realized that the situation was not good. Someone with this kind of godly aura was most likely an incarnation of the God Emperor. Sure enough, when his divine sense gathered on that aura, he was able to clearly see the source of that aura. It was a male god race cultivator dressed in an exquisite nebula robe and holding a feather fan. This person was handsome and had a graceful bearing. He had 2 strands of beard at the corner of his mouth and was sitting on the throne in the conference hall. When Ji Tianqing's divine sense touched him, he smiled and flew out of the conference hall. Swish! The white-robed man flew to the sky above the palace and looked at Ji Tianqing's hiding place with a smile. He said in a clear voice, "Kenshin, this emperor has been waiting for you here for several months. You are finally here." It was obvious that this white-robed man, who called himself this emperor, was the incarnation of the God Emperor, Dao Xingyun. Not only had he arrived at the Heavenly Strategy Divine Residence long ago, but he had also discovered Ji Tianqing, who had concealed his aura and locked onto Ji Tianqing's location. Since he had already been exposed, there was no point for Ji Tianqing to continue hiding. He simply revealed himself and stood high in the sky, facing off against Dao Xingyun from 25 kilometers away. After 1,000 years, the 2 people who had a blood feud met again. Ji Tianqing's expression was cold, and his eyes were sharp. Dao Xingyun acted as if nothing had happened. He had a calm expression and a faint smile on his lips as he waved his feather fan slowly. Seeing that the other party was so calm, Ji Tianqing said in a deep voice, "The Heavenly Strategy Star Domain has been peaceful along the way. Everything on the Heavenly Strategy Star Domain is also normal. Even this mystic realm didn't have any abnormalities, both inside and outside. I originally thought that after knowing that I had destroyed the incarnation of the god of the underworld, you would cherish your incarnation and wouldn't dare to come personally. I didn't expect that you would still come and not give up on the Heavenly Strategy Star Domain, Lord." Dao Xingyun's incarnation smiled and said calmly, "That's right. The god of the underworld told us about that matter." Everyone was indeed surprised. We couldn't believe that Kenshin, who had been dead for more than 1,100 years, had actually come back to life. Moreover, he had recovered to his peak state and was even stronger than before. But do you think that this emperor would be afraid and ignore the Heavenly Strategy Star Domain? Do you think that this emperor would be afraid of you and give up on the entire Heavenly Strategy Star Domain? Ha 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 ha. You are too confident. You are just a peak god king. If you don't reach the God Emperor realm, you will forever be an ant. Dao Xingyun's calm voice was filled with unquestionable confidence and dominance. After saying that, he clapped his hands as if he was sending out some kind of signal. Following that, the auras of several god kings emerged from the palaces under his feet. The auras of several hundred godly kings abruptly appeared within the palaces and buildings in the dozen or so mountain peaks in all directions. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Those god king experts who were originally hidden, so Ji Tianqing didn't notice them for a moment, flew into the sky one after another and revealed themselves. Ji Tianqing's expression changed slightly. His pupils constricted as he scanned the area with his divine sense. He discovered that more than 600 god kings had appeared out of thin air. One had to know that when he released his divine sense to search the palaces, he only discovered about 30 god kings. But at this time, over 600 divine king powerhouses actually emerged from the palace complex. This was enough to show that the 600 god kings had been hiding here for a long time and had been waiting for his arrival. How could more than 600 god kings have gathered in the Heavenly Strategy Divine Abode? Seeing that these god kings were of different races and that most of them were mid-rank god kings, Ji Tianqing understood. It must be Dao Xingyun who had given the order to gather many star lords to reinforce him. The other party had laid in ambush here to wait for him to appear before joining forces to attack. Dao Xingyun, you are such a scheming person. You are so vicious. Ji Tianqing's gaze swept across the hundreds of god kings and finally landed on Dao Xingyun as he asked in a deep voice. On my way here, the entire star domain, Heavenly Strategy Star, and this mystic realm were very peaceful. There were no flaws at all. How did you do it? You were able to gather so many god kings without anyone noticing anything amiss? Not only this mystic realm, but even the entire Heavenly Strategy Star was cooperating with you to put on an act? Dao Xingyun, your scheming and methods are even better than back then. Facing Ji Tianqing's questioning, Dao Xingyun smiled calmly and explained, I had given the order to keep it a secret. Very few people knew about this, so it was naturally kept secret. The entire star domain and the people of Heavenly Strategy Star didn't know about it, so how could the news be leaked? Chapter 40-30. The citizens of the Heavenly Strategy Star do not know, and the guards of the Heavenly Strategy Divine Residence do not know either. Even the 600+ god kings had secretly gathered there. If even they do not know what is going on, the news can naturally be concealed. Moreover, I arrived here 3 months ago and made arrangements and ambushes in advance. Naturally, everything is going smoothly. As long as you are careful and attentive, you will definitely be able to do it without any flaws. Although Dao Xingyun had said it in a simple and light manner, everyone knew that things were definitely not that simple. Under Ji Tianqing's careful and vigilant state, Dao Xingyun was still able to set up such a perfect ambush and only reveal his true colors at the end. It could be seen that Dao Xingyun had spent a lot of time and effort. This also made Ji Tianxing realize that Dao Xingyun, who was good at scheming among the 5 emperors, had become even more sinister. But things had already reached this stage. Dao Xingyun and the 600 divine kings had heavily surrounded Ji Tianxing. Saying anything else was unnecessary. Only by fighting to the death could they break out of the encirclement. The heavens and earth were silent. The 600 divine kings had already arranged themselves into a huge formation in different directions and surrounded a radius of 1,000 miles. Dao Xingyun waved his feather fan lightly and looked at Ji Tianxing with a smile. He said confidently, "Kenshin, you have the ability to destroy the incarnation of the god of the underworld. I admit that I am not much stronger than the god of the underworld. Therefore, if we fight one-on-one, you should be able to defeat this incarnation of mine. However, I will definitely not give you the chance to do so. Now, I have mobilized more than half of the Star Lords of the Star Field. 600 divine kings have gathered here. Even if you are a god emperor, you will definitely die, let alone a peak divine king. Give up struggling. I can give you a dignified death. Of course, if you can hand over the exterminating heavens portrait, I can still spare your life." Dao Xingyun was confident that he could restrain Ji Tianxing. With over 600 god kings surrounding him, Ji Tianxing would definitely die. Since victory was in his hands, he naturally had to negotiate terms with Ji Tianxing in exchange for greater benefit. Ji Tianxing secretly sneered but pretended to be stunned. He then sneered in disdain. "There are more than 600 Star Lords, so what? They are just a bunch of clay chickens and pottery dogs. Less than 20% of them are high-level divine kings, and 80% of them are middle-level divine kings. What can they do to me?" Hee. Dao Xingyun was too lazy to argue with him. He gently waved his fan and smiled. "There are so many of us here. You know very well whether we can kill you or not. Why are you putting up a strong front? Don't talk nonsense. Hand over the execution heaven scroll and I will spare your life. Keep your word." Seeing that Dao Xingyun was unwilling to let go of the execution heavens diagram, Ji Tianxing understood that he was very eager for the diagram. However, he could not admit that the execution of the heavens scroll was in his hands. He had to say the same thing as last time. "Execution of the heavens scroll?" If I had the execution of the heavens scroll, I would have broken through to the God-Emperor realm long ago. Why would I need to talk nonsense with you? I originally thought that after I fell, the execution of the heavens scroll was taken away by you. Now it seems that you didn't get it either. How ironic, ha ha ha." Hearing Ji Tianxing's words, the smile on Dao Xingyun's face disappeared and he frowned gloomily. He remained silent and stared at Ji Tianxing, as if trying to discern the truth of his words. Obviously, he did not believe Ji Tianxing's words. He was not the god of the underworld. He was not so easily fooled. However, Ji Tianxing's expression, tone, and words could not find any loopholes. He was also skeptical. "Kenshin, whether you are telling the truth or not, I don't care. After I kill you later, I will carefully examine your body and godhood. By then, the truth will be revealed." In the end, Dao Xingyun still maintained his skeptical attitude and waved his hand to give the order to attack. "Kill him!" Following Dao Xingyun's order, the 600 god kings all waved their swords and Kenshin soldiers and used their ultimate skills to attack Ji Tianxing. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Boom, boom, boom. The dazzling brilliance of the divine skill lit up and illuminated a radius of tens of thousands of miles. The shadows of swords, wind, fire, and lightning covered the sky and fell on Ji Tianxing like a flood. Every god king gave it their all and used their ultimate skills that were enough to destroy the heavens and earth. The combined attack of 600 people was enough to turn the palaces in a radius of 1,000 miles into ruins and debris. However, those god kings did not hesitate at all. Their expressions and eyes were filled with determination. They had already received Dao Xingyun's order. Even if they had to destroy this palace, destroy the entire mystic realm, and even destroy the entire heavenly strategy planet, they had to kill Ji Tianxing completely. Once they killed Ji Tianxing, it would be a great achievement that would leave their names in history. They would also be the biggest obstacle and threat to Dao Xingyun and the other god emperors. In comparison, the heavenly strategy planet was not that important. Facing such a fierce attack, Ji Tianxing did not hesitate to use his teleportation technique to escape from the encirclement. He knew clearly that no matter how strong he was, he would not be able to withstand the attacks of 600 god kings. Moreover, Dao Xingyun's incarnation was still eyeing him covetously and could attack at any time. Right now, he was not thinking about how to kill all these god kings. Instead, he was thinking about how to escape so that he could escape from their pursuit. Of course, only by breaking through the encirclement of so many god kings and lengthening the battle line would he have a chance to counterattack. Swish! Ji Tianxing used his powers to cast a spell as a dazzling white light surged from his body. He was about to tear open space and teleport. However, Dao Xingyun and a few hundred god kings had already set up a sealing array in this area. Ji Tianxing only felt that he was in a quagmire. It was difficult for him to move, and the difficulty of tearing open space had increased exponentially. Fortunately, his divine power was vigorous enough, and he had the indestructible golden body to protect him. Even if forcefully tearing open space would damage his divine body, he did not care. Swoosh! A white light flashed. 1 second later, Ji Tianxing passed through the sky full of sword shadows and lightning, successfully tearing open space and teleporting thousands of miles away. Although he had used up a lot of his divine power, his face was pale, and he was panting a little. He had successfully broken through the encirclement and caused the attacks of a few hundred god kings to fail. Boom! 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 He was in the sky thousands of miles away. When he turned his head to look, he saw the overwhelming radiance of divine techniques landing on dozens of mountains and palaces, causing flames and dust to erupt into the sky. At least 20 mountains were blasted into smithereens and collapsed into ruins. Those exquisite and dignified palaces were also blasted into smithereens, leaving behind dilapidated walls and dilapidated walls. There were also thousands of guards and servants who did not manage to retreat in time and were accidentally injured by the god kings. They died tragically on the spot, not even leaving behind ashes. Seeing this scene, Ji Tianxing understood how determined Dao Xingyun was to kill him. Hundreds of god kings had failed to injure Ji Tianxing with their attacks. Instead, they had killed many of their own. They were all ashamed and angry. Without needing Dao Xingyun to give the order, they spread out and formed an even bigger encirclement as they charged towards Ji Tianxing. Chapter 40-31. Ji Tianxing had already been surrounded once. How could he be surrounded a second time? When hundreds of godly monarchs rushed over, he took out the burial of heaven without hesitation and used his ultimate skill. Sword rain! The burial of heaven pointed the sword to the sky. As he shouted, tens of thousands of silver light spots appeared in the sky. From afar, the silver light spots covered the sky like a meteor shower. However, as the silver light spots fell rapidly, everyone saw that they were more than 80,000 starry swords. Each starry sword was more than 20,000 feet long. They were more dazzling than the meteors and more violent. When hundreds of godly monarchs caught up with Ji Tianxing and were about to surround him, the 80,000 starry swords finally descended. Soon, the starry swords covered a radius of 30,000 miles. Everyone was enveloped by the starry swords and was about to be blasted into smithereens. However, at this moment, Dao Xingyun, who had been calm all this while, frowned as his face turned gloomy. This was because he could clearly feel the terrifying power of the starry swords. If he did not resolve it, more than half of the hundreds of godly monarchs would be killed. He had no choice. Ji Tianxing's ultimate skill was too destructive. It was an area attack and was most suitable for group attack. Starry Sky. At this critical moment, Dao Xingyun formed a seal with his left hand and waved his feather fan with his right hand. He used the power of Heaven Wei with all his might. Swoosh! A trace of rainbow-colored Taoist rhyme circled above his head. The power of the way of the heavens that he released gathered the endless power of the stars in an instant, forming thousands of light balls in the air above everyone's heads. Each light ball had a diameter of 30,000 feet. They shone with silver light like stars. More than 5,000 silver stars covered the entire sky and became the first barrier against the starry sword. Just as the 5,000 stars were formed, more than 80,000 starry swords came down and clashed with each other. Bam! 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 An earth-shattering explosion erupted, shaking the heavens and spreading throughout the entire secret realm. At that moment, the huge silver ball of light and the huge sword of stars collapsed and exploded at the same time, splashing out endless fragments of starlight. Incomparably violent hurricanes mixed with fragments of starlight swept out in all directions for tens of thousands of miles. The surrounding mountains and forests were all destroyed into ruins. Endless dust surged into the sky like huge waves, covering the sky and the sun. In just one breath's time, the thousands of stars released by Dao Xingyun were all shattered by the starry sword. Although the great starry sword had also shattered quite a bit. However, there were as many as 80,000 swords. Even if 20,000 swords were destroyed, there would still be 60,000 swords left. Without a doubt, these 60,000 giant swords all smashed into the ground, covering 30,000 miles of ruins. A new round of earth-shattering explosions erupted. Rumble! Dust and dirt flew into the air again, and huge waves surged into the sky, mixed with a torrent of divine light. The sound was just too terrifying. It completely drowned out the screams and howls of the God Kings. Dozens of weaker mid-level God Kings were unable to dodge in time, nor were they able to block the starry swords. These unlucky fellows were all hit by at least a few swords. Their godly bodies were shattered on the spot, and even their godheads were shattered. There were more than 40 God Kings who died on the spot. There were more than 100 God Kings who were heavily injured and badly mutilated by the giant swords. There were also more than 200 God Kings who suffered lighter injuries. There were only about 100 God Kings who were lucky enough not to be injured. Firstly, there were more than half of them who were high-level God Kings. Secondly, Dao Xingyun saw that the situation was not right, so he used his ultimate skill in time to neutralize many of the starry swords. However, even so, the God Kings still suffered heavy casualties after a round of attacks from the starry swords. When the earth-shattering explosions gradually subsided, the dust that covered the sky dissipated, and peace returned to the world. At that moment, there were only 600 God Kings who were still alive, and most of them were injured. Dao Xingyun's face grew gloomier and gloomier. He could no longer maintain his composure. He looked around fiercely and chased after Ji Tianxing's figure. Without a doubt, Ji Tianxing had already escaped from the battlefield. He flew tens of thousands of miles away and was running towards the exit of the mystic realm. Seeing this, Dao Xingyun was not in a hurry to chase after him. He sneered and said, "Since you came in, you still want to escape? You're too naive. The entire mystic realm has been sealed by a divine formation set up by me. I don't want you to return." As he said that, Dao Xingyun waved his hands and conjured a divine art. He sent out a few strands of heaven Dao power into the surrounding heaven and earth. Suddenly, the edges of the mystic realm lit up with dazzling 5-colored divine light. They quickly gathered in the sky and formed a huge light shield. A supreme-grade king-level sealing divine formation was activated just like that. As the formation started to operate, a boundless formless power descended from the sky. Under Dao Xingyun's control, The sealing power of the sealing divine formation was mainly concentrated on Ji Tianqing. Everyone could clearly see that Ji Tianqing, who was originally flying at high speed, suddenly slowed down and fell from the sky. The facts proved that Dao Xingyun did not lie, and there was no need for him to lie. He led the 600 surviving God Kings and chased after Ji Tianqing at a moderate pace. Ji Tianqing saw that the supreme grade sealing divine formation of the mystic realm could not be broken in a short period of time. Hence, he could only turn around and fight. In order to break through the sealing divine formation, the best way was to kill and destroy the entire mystic realm with the help of the shockwaves from the fight between him and Dao Xingyun. Dao Xingyun, you forced me to do this. You want to trap me with 600 divine kings and the formation? Then I'll kill all of your lackeys. Ji Tianqing's face was cold as he growled with a murderous look. He took out the thunderclap hammer and held it in his left hand and the sword of burial of heaven in his right hand. His body was burning with golden flames. At the same time, he opened the Sword World and Jiutian 10 Absolutes Pagoda to release Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others. Everyone knew that Dao Xingyun and a few hundred divine kings had ambushed him, and they were very worried about his safety. Especially Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others. No matter what, they had to join the battle and help him. Ji Tianqing had no choice but to agree and remind everyone to be careful and not let anything happen to them. Of course, everyone who joined the battle was at the Divine King realm. Ji Wuhan, the left emissary Jin, and the Blood Dragon right emissary had not reached the Divine King realm yet, so they stayed in the distorted spacetime to cultivate. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. As rays of white light flashed, everyone appeared one after another. After they saw the situation clearly, their faces were as solemn as their hearts. However, their eyes were very determined and there was no fear or cowardice in them. They all waved their divine weapons and charged towards the divine kings without any regard for their own safety. Ji Tianqing was worried about everyone's safety. Hence, he took the lead and charged out. He used all his strength to perform his ultimate skills and charged towards Dao Xingyun and the other high-level divine kings. Meanwhile, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others focused on dealing with the mid-level divine kings. Chapter 40-32. Absolute Shadows of the 10 Directions. Ji Tianqing would always use this very practical move whenever he was outnumbered. As he roared, his body glowed with divine light. 9 identical figures appeared around him. As a result, the 10 Ji Tianqings charged into the battlefield with murderous intent. They rampaged through the crowd of several hundred god kings and crushed them wantonly. 10,000 swords. Heavenly dragon slash. Sky-splitting sword. Daylight sword. Sword breaking 9 heavens. God-slaying sword. Ji Tianqing and his 9 clones used different sword Dao ultimate move. Sword lights filled the sky as they slashed into the crowd. At the same time, they waved their divine hammers and shot out lightning pillars and fireballs at Dao Xingyun. Dao Xingyun was indeed very powerful. No matter what divine arts Ji Tianqing used, he would be able to resolve them easily. He would not be injured at all. However, Ji Tianqing had too many clones. 2 of them were tasked with holding him back. They used all kinds of divine arts and ultimate moves to surround and attack him crazily. Dao Xingyun could protect himself and would not be injured. However, he was held back and could not support the hundreds of god kings. Hence, as time passed, the battlefield was gradually split into 2. On one side, Ji Tianqing's original body and 7 clones led Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others to deal with the hundreds of god kings. On the other side of the battlefield, tens of thousands of miles away, Ji Tianqing's 2 clones attacked Dao Xingyun without caring about anything else. Although the 2 clones and Dao Xingyun were evenly matched in the battle, Dao Xingyun's strength would gradually weaken. However, as time passed, the power of the clone would continue to weaken, and it would eventually be defeated by the nebula. On the other side, The Heavenly Strategy Region Lord led 600 God Kings to surround and attack Ji Tianxing and the others. They had the upper hand. In the beginning, Ji Tianxing led the charge. He was like a sharp blade that pierced into the battlefield, killing many alien God Kings. However, after he killed over 30 God Kings, the remaining 500 God Kings surrounded them. Not only were Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others trapped and unable to break out of the encirclement, but they were also unable to kill their opponents. Even Ji Tianxing and his avatar were besieged by many alien God Kings. They were unable to break through the encirclement. Moreover, he had to take care of Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Ji Wushuang, and the others. He was afraid that their lives would be in danger. As a result, his lethality was further reduced, and it was difficult for him to go on a rampage. The battle had entered a stalemate. Ji Tianxing was safe and sound. No divine king could harm him. However, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others started to get injured and bleed. Their strength also started to weaken. After an hour of fighting, the beautiful women's hair was disheveled, and their clothes were dirty and stained with blood. White Dragon, Chao Qingyu, Bai Feng, and the others were also injured. However, they did not have the time to treat their injuries. The one who was injured the most was Yank, who was the most ferocious in every charge. He was the biggest, and his fighting style was too bold. He was too ferocious and not agile enough. As a result, after an hour of fighting, his body was covered in wounds. Blood dyed him red. Fortunately, those wounds were not fatal. He only looked more miserable, but he could still continue fighting. In the blink of an eye, 2 hours had passed. Ji Tianxing's 2 avatars were greatly weakened. Soon, one of them was defeated by Dao Xingyun. No matter how ferocious the remaining avatar's attacks were, it was very difficult for it to hold back Dao Xingyun. On the other side of the battlefield, Ji Tianxing and the others had killed nearly 100 divine kings. They had also paid a certain price. If the stalemate continued, Dao Xingyun would come to help after destroying the avatar. By then, Ji Tianxing and the others would be defeated even more miserably. Especially Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Chao Qingyu, and the others. Not only would they be severely injured, but they might even be killed. Therefore, Ji Tianxing made a decisive decision. Retreat. He and his 7 avatars no longer charged forward. They started to cover Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others as they gathered together. This process was very difficult. It also took 100 breaths to complete. After everyone gathered together, he and his 7 avatars formed a defensive circle to protect everyone. They covered everyone as they returned to the distorted space of the divine pagoda. Although everyone was very worried about his safety, they were still worried about him. However, everyone knew his plan. They also understood that it would only be more dangerous if they continued to fight. Therefore, they all entered the divine pagoda. Swish, swish, swish. As rays of white light flashed, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, and the others disappeared one after another. After everyone returned to the distorted space, Ji Tianxing then led his 7 avatars to break out of the encirclement. Sword breaking the 9 heavens. Sword of annihilation. Blade of spacetime. Ji Tianxing and his 7 avatars swung their swords at the same time. They used a sword Dao divine ability that could destroy heaven and earth and slash towards the group of divine kings in the south. Boom, boom, boom. Amid the deafening sound, a huge gap was torn open in the encirclement. Blood and dust splattered everywhere. More than 20 divine kings of the foreign races were sliced into pieces by the sword light. Their broken limbs were scattered all over the ground. Swish. The 7 avatars instantly merged and returned to Ji Tianxing's body. He went through the gap in the encirclement alone and tried his best to escape to the mystic realm's exit. It was too late for the 470 or so foreign god kings to stop him. All they could do was chase after him. In fact, Ji Tianxing did not think that he would be able to break out of the encirclement and escape from the mystic realm by breaking out of the encirclement. He did this because he wanted to shake off the few hundred divine kings of the foreign races and fight Dao Xingyun alone. After all, Dao Xingyun's speed was much faster than those divine kings. As expected, Ji Tianxing reached the Mystic Realm's exit after flying for 80,000 miles. At this moment, the few hundred injured and panicking divine kings were still about 40,000 miles away from him. However, Dao Xingyun's avatar had already teleported over and caught up with Ji Tianxing. Trying to escape? Stay behind! Dao Xingyun shouted angrily when he was still 10,000 feet away from Ji Tianxing. He held a silver dragon-engraved divine spear with both hands and stabbed it at Ji Tianxing. He did not use his weapon when dealing with Ji Tianxing's two avatars because he felt that Ji Tianxing's avatars were not worthy of him using his weapon. However, when he saw that the Star Lords had suffered heavy casualties, he decided to end the battle quickly and took out the silver dragon-engraved divine spear. This spear was also a supreme-grade king-level divine artifact, but it was not congenital. It was forged by Dao Xingyun after he became a god-emperor and forcefully fused his Daoist aura with it. This was one of his natal divine artifacts, and its power was not inferior to a supreme-grade divine artifact that was congenital. It was very fierce. Swoosh! As soon as the godly spear appeared, two silvery dragon shadows that were thousands of feet long charged towards Ji Tianxing with the power to destroy the heavens and earth. The silver dragon shadows also contained the power of the heavenly Tao and released a powerful pressure. This time Dao Xingyun was serious. He attacked with all his strength in order to kill Ji Tianxing as soon as possible. He originally thought that by using the power of the heavenly Tao, he would definitely be able to suppress Ji Tianxing and greatly weaken Ji Tianxing's strength. He did not expect that the power of the heavenly Tao would not affect Ji Tianxing at all. Chapter 40-33. The power of the heavenly Tao had a natural pressure on all living beings below the God-Emperor realm. Even ordinary peak-stage god-kings would be afraid and their combat strength would be greatly reduced. However, Ji Tianxing was rather special. He was actually immune to the pressure of the heavenly Tao. Previously, he had even mocked himself. This was probably the compensation the heavenly Tao gave him, right? After all, he had made merits several times but did not receive any rewards from the heavenly Tao. Originally, Dao Xingyun's two spears were bound to succeed, making it impossible for Ji Tianxing to dodge or block. Even if he could not kill Ji Tianxing, he could still injure him. However, he did not expect Ji Tianxing to not be affected by the pressure at all. His figure flashed and moved 10,000 feet horizontally, brushing past the two silver dragon spear shadows. Such a scene was extremely thrilling. If there was any mistake, the two silver dragon spear shadows would stab him. As for Ji Tianxing, he naturally had his own reasons for doing so. The two silver dragon spear shadows locked onto his soul aura. If he teleported 5,000 kilometers, the two spear shadows would definitely turn and continue to chase after him. However, when the silver dragon spear shadows approached, he suddenly teleported 10,000 feet and dodged the spear shadows. As a result, the two spear shadows did not have time to turn and chase after him. They stabbed at the five-colored light wall behind him. The five-colored light wall that was like a sky curtain was the ceiling array set up by Dao Xingyun. Kaboom! In the next moment, the two silver dragon spear shadows pierced the five-colored sky curtain at the same time, producing a deafening sound and splashing divine light fragments all over the sky. Without a doubt, the silver dragon spear shadows were more powerful. They pierced two huge cracks in the five-colored light wall, creating a gap. Then, the silver dragon spear shadows were also shattered, producing countless silver light fragments. Seeing this scene, Dao Xingyun instantly came to a realization and guessed Ji Tianxing's scheme. He immediately cursed. "Damn it! Kenshin, you sinister and despicable person!" As expected, Ji Tianxing ignored him completely. His figure flashed and shrank into a speck of dust. He passed through the gap in the 5-colored light wall and escaped the ceiling array. Shwa! He rushed to the exit of the secret realm and unleashed a beam of divine light with a wave of his hand to open the exit. A blazing white door of light appeared, hovering above an altar. Without hesitation, Ji Tianxing stepped through the light door and escaped from the secret realm. At this moment, Dao Xingyun, who had regained his senses, chased after him with his spear, and fiercely thrust out a few spear shadows. However, Ji Tianxing was one step too slow. Those few spear shadows crashed into the blazing white light door, but Ji Tianxing had already disappeared. Damn it! Seeing this, Dao Xingyun cursed loudly. He didn't want to waste time repairing the damaged altars and divine formations, and opening the exit of the secret realm. He waved the silver dragon divine spear and tore apart the spatial barrier of the secret realm, creating a pitch-black spatial crack. Of course, this spatial rift didn't lead to the outerium. There were several layers of folded space. After passing through those layers of folded space, one could leave the secret realm and appear at the square at the entrance of the secret realm. Shwa! With the protection of the heavenly energy, Dao Xingyun wasn't afraid of the void and folded space at all. His figure flashed as he plunged into the darkness. Before long, more than 400 godly kings of the foreign races had caught up. However, when they saw the damaged altar and the spatial rift that had yet to heal, they all stopped in their tracks. What should we do? Do you still need to ask? Of course, we should chase after him. But if we pass through that spatial rift, we might be smashed into pieces. What are you waiting for? Quickly repair the altar and restart the divine formation. The godly kings of the foreign races looked at each other, not knowing what to do. At this critical moment, the region master of heavenly strategies forced himself to endure the heavy injuries and decisively gave the order. Hence, dozens of high-level godly kings joined forces and cast spells to repair the altar in the shortest time possible. Shwa! After the region master of heavenly strategies reactivated the divine formation, a blazing white door of light appeared again. Let's go! The region master of heavenly strategies shouted as he took the lead and stepped through the door of light. He led the group of godly kings out of the secret realm. However, when they appeared at the square at the entrance of the secret realm, they could only look at the surrounding sky in a daze. The square was very peaceful, and the surrounding sky was also quiet and peaceful. There was nothing unusual. As for Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun, they had already disappeared. No one knew where they had gone. Region Master, what should we do now? It's over. That Kenshin has escaped. Don't worry. Kenshin can't escape. Lord Supreme has already chased after him. But is it appropriate for us to stay here and let Lord Supreme chase after him? Of course, we have to help Lord Supreme attack Kenshin. But who knows where they went? A group of godly kings of the foreign races surrounded the region master of heavenly strategies. They were so anxious that they could only rub their hands and stomp their feet. However, there was nothing they could do. At this critical moment, they still had to rely on the region master of heavenly strategies. Under everyone's gaze, he took out a communication jade slip and sent a message to Dao Xingyun's incarnation to ask for directions. Soon, Dao Xingyun sent a message back and reprimanded him. Useless thing. You are at a loss when faced with such an emergency. What a useless thing. Can't you calm down and observe the sky carefully? When I left, I clearly left a mark. After reading the contents of the communication jade slip, the region master of heavenly strategies finally understood. He hurriedly observed the surrounding sky and found that there was indeed a trace of 5-colored divine power left in the southeast sky. That trace of divine power couldn't be seen with the naked eye. It was like a thread floating in the sky, but it wouldn't be blown away by the wind. The region master of heavenly strategies was instantly energized. He waved his hand and said, I have found the direction. Everyone, follow me. As a result, He led more than 400 alien god-kings and charged towards the southeast in a grandiose fashion. Southeast of the heavenly strategy's divine abode, about 300,000 miles away. Above the white sea of clouds, Ji Tianxing was like a streak of light that sped through the air. 10,000 miles behind him, Dao Xingyun's incarnation was hot on his heels. Both of them burst forth with their fastest speed. They were even faster than a shooting star streaking across the sky. In a short period of time, both of them couldn't pull apart the distance between them. Dao Xingyun also couldn't intercept Ji Tianxing. Thus, Dao Xingyun didn't forget to send a voice transmission while chasing Ji Tianxing. He roared, "Kenshin, no matter how fast you run, it's useless. I spent so much time and effort to set up this perfect trap just to kill you in one fell swoop. Do you think you can escape? To tell you the truth, I have set up a huge array to seal the entire heavenly strategy's star. No matter what, you can't escape from the heavenly strategy's star." Ji Tianxing understood Dao Xingyun's nature. Of course, he knew that he wasn't lying. If he said he would do it, then he would do it. You use the heavenly strategy's star as a disk array to seal the entire star just to kill me? Dao Xingyun, you are really deranged. You are willing to do anything. Have you ever thought that this will destroy the entire heavenly strategy's star and cause hundreds of billions of lives to be buried with you? Ji Tianxing's expression was gloomy as he cursed fiercely. Seeing his reaction, Dao Xingyun immediately sneered proudly. Who are you? You are Kenshin. So what if I sacrifice a heavenly strategy star? As long as I can kill you, those hundreds of billions of lives will be buried with you. It is their honor. Chapter 40-34. Dao Xingyun was laughing and his voice was a little noisy. But the content of his words was bone-chilling and made people's hearts palpitate. Ji Tianxing didn't have any sense of acknowledgement or familiarity with the alien creatures in the outer realm. But the billions of living beings on the heavenly policy planet were all living beings. If the roles were reversed, he would never sacrifice billions of lives to kill Dao Xingyun. This was the difference between Ji Tianxing and the top experts and the 5 God Emperors. In the eyes of the top experts and the 5 God Emperors, everyone below the God Emperors were ants. No matter how many died, they didn't feel anything. Because they saw themselves as gods, omnipotent gods who ignored life and lived as long as heaven and earth. But Ji Tianxing was different. Even though he had been a god for so many years and had recovered to the 9th level of the Divine King realm, he was still a human. His humanity hadn't been erased and still existed firmly. Of course, Ji Tianxing also knew that Dao Xingyun's views were deeply rooted and couldn't be persuaded. Now that he was being chased by Dao Xingyun, it was even more impossible for Dao Xingyun to give up. In order to get rid of Dao Xingyun, Ji Tianxing unleashed 120% of his power and raised his speed to the limit. Dao Xingyun also wanted to speed up and kill him, but using the teleportation divine ability overloaded would increase the consumption of his divine power. The power of this clone was fixed. If it was consumed too quickly, its combat power would be greatly reduced. At that time, it would be unknown whether he could still kill Ji Tianxing. Therefore, Dao Xingyun could only suppress his anxiety and watch Ji Tianxing get further and further away from him. Although Ji Tianxing pulled away from him, he didn't panic and definitely wouldn't let Ji Tianxing escape. He immediately ordered his subordinates guarding the heavenly policy planet to activate the sealing array at the same time. 2 months ago, when he set up these arrays, he had thought of this result. Now it came in handy. Swoosh. Swish, swish, swish. Almost at the same time, more than 300 grand formations scattered all over the heavenly policy planet were activated. Thousands of divine lords had cast over 300 arrays together. They absorbed the power of heaven and earth and condensed into a massive canopy that extended in all directions. Thus, all of the living beings on the heavenly strategy planet and all of the continents could see a gigantic 5-colored sky that encompassed the entire world slowly rise into the air. The entire heavenly policy planet became colorful and dazzling. However, between the heavens and the earth, there was an invisible force that imprisoned the air. The air seemed to have become viscous and the space seemed to have solidified. Hundreds of millions of non-humankind civilians were woken up. They were panicked, confused, and anxious by the sudden change. Fortunately, other than sealing the world and making people feel extremely oppressed, the five-colored sky curtain did not cause any damage. Although the people of the various continents were confused, anxious, and worried, they were not in a state of chaos. The battle between Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun had just begun. Shua! Ji Tianxing was still flying high in the sky, but his flying speed had obviously decreased by a lot. Besides, it was extremely difficult for him to use the teleportation divine power. It consumed a few times more divine power than before. The creatures of the non-humankind weren't scared because they weren't flying at full speed, so they didn't realize the terrifying power of the sky-covering array. However, Ji Tianxing was flying high in the sky. The faster he was, the stronger the suppression of the sky-covering array became. When he used teleportation, it was equivalent to fighting against the sky-covering array, so he was naturally suppressed and locked down by the most powerful suppression. When he slowed down, Dao Xingyun's speed wasn't affected at all. Among the billions of living beings on the heavenly policy planet, he was the only one who could move freely without being affected by the sky-covering array. After all, he was the creator and controller of the super-divine array. Swish! After chasing for 1,000,000 miles, Dao Xingyun finally caught up with Ji Tianxing and blocked his path. The two of them stopped high in the sky and stood 1,000 miles apart, facing each other with murderous intent. Dao Xingyun looked at Ji Tianxing with a cold smile and asked, "Kenshin, this is the first time I've used the sky-covering array that I've researched in my early years. Are you satisfied?" Ji Tianxing said expressionlessly, "Using the entire planet as the disk and hundreds of divine arrays as nodes to create a super-divine array to seal the entire planet is indeed an impressive technique. However, you've spent a few months and commanded countless divine kings and divine lords to work for you. Therefore, this sky-covering array isn't worthy of you showing off. Besides, with this divine array, you can only create some trouble for me. You can't trap me at all." Dao Xingyun had expected him to say this. He couldn't help but sneer, "That's right. A divine array to seal the entire planet is considered a top divine array technique, but it's not the strongest. After all, using many planets as a divine array to seal and mobilize a sea of stars or a river of stars is the top divine array technique. However, don't forget that I'm just a clone. If I'm here in person, I can even seal half of the heavenly policy starfield with the divine array. Indeed, using the river of stars as the disk and the planets as the foundation was the top divine array technique in the world. Only God Emperor experts could use it. Even Kenshin at his peak couldn't do it. However, when Ji Tianxing heard Dao Xingyun's words, he couldn't help but sneer. "If you were here in person, you would have killed me already. Why would you talk so much nonsense? However, why did you only send a clone here? Where's your real body? Why didn't you do it yourself? What kind of power is binding and sealing you? Or are you guys carrying out some unspeakable conspiracy?" Ji Tianxing looked askance at Dao Xingyun. His eyes were cold and sharp, as if he wanted to see through Dao Xingyun. Dao Xingyun immediately frowned, his heart skipping a beat. He couldn't help but suspect that Ji Tianxing had guessed something, or had he heard some rumors. However, he and the other 4 God Emperor experts had taken precautions at the Grey Fog's divine array. They had kept the information very well protected. He thought that as long as Ji Tianxing didn't get close to the Grey Fog's divine array, he wouldn't know what they were doing. However, Ji Tianxing's expression and tone proved that he had guessed something. This made Dao Xingyun nervous and worried. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. This is bad. Kenshin has already noticed our plan. If we don't kill him today, He'll definitely try to obstruct and sabotage our plans in the future. I have to inform the other 4 as soon as possible and let them take precautions and strengthen the secrecy. I can't let them think that I'm the one who leaked the information. There are already some conflicts and suspicions between us. If a rift appears because of this, I'm afraid it will endanger our plan. Dao Xingyun and the other 4 God Emperor experts were the same. They all viewed the plan as the most important thing in their lives. It was as important as their own lives. They would never allow it to be obstructed or sabotaged. Therefore, he was even more determined to kill Ji Tianqing. Chapter 40-35. Dao Xingyun didn't reveal anything when he set up the sky shrouding array. Everything was done in secret. He didn't inform the overlords of the continents or ask the people of the heavenly policy planet to evacuate because he didn't want Ji Tianqing to be alerted. He could only kill Ji Tianqing when he least expected it. And now he was even more determined to kill Ji Tianqing at any cost. Even if he had to destroy the heavenly policy planet and sacrifice billions of lives, he wouldn't hesitate. Kenshin, you still want to trick me into giving you some information and secrets with such a clumsy method? You're too naive. Dao Xingyun sneered and said, so what if you have doubts and guesses? You'll definitely die today. Everything will end. This world and the endless universe will be the territory of the 5 God Emperors after all. Then, Dao Xingyun stopped talking nonsense with Ji Tianqing in case he exposed himself. He formed a divine art with his left hand and waved the silver dragon divine spear with his right hand. He summoned the divine power of heaven and earth within a few 100,000 miles and attacked Ji Tianqing. Swish, swish, swish. Within a radius of a few 100,000 miles, the divine energy of heaven and earth swarmed over, transforming into a 5-colored torrent. It condensed into a myriad of divine art lights and shadows, and shot towards Ji Tianqing. Ji Tianqing wasn't afraid at all. He completely activated the power of the indestructible golden body. He waved the divine hammer with his left hand and the burial of heaven with his right hand, creating sword auras that filled the sky. He even took out the chaotic primordial bell, which floated above his head to help him resist the attacks of thousands of divine arts. Boom, 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 boom. Divine light shadows blotted out the sky and covered the earth. Endless wind, fire, and lightning bombarded Ji Tianqing with incomparable violence. But 90% of the divine arts were blocked by the chaotic primordial bell and destroyed by Ji Tianqing's lightning and sword auras. The remaining 10% of the divine arts hit him, but they were also blocked by the indestructible golden body. Although he was surrounded by endless flames and seemed to be in danger, he was actually unharmed. But in reality, he was completely unscathed. The divine art attacks formed by divine power could no longer harm him. After all, his strength had reached the peak of the God-King realm. He had also reached the peak of divine power and the use of laws. Only the power of the heavenly Tao, a power that surpassed divine power and laws, could hurt him. Similarly, Dao Xingyun's avatar was in the same situation. No matter what divine power or how many laws of divine power he used, he couldn't hurt Dao Xingyun. Only a power that surpassed divine power and laws, such as the power of a world, could injure Dao Nebula. In addition, Dao's avatar had a god's divine powers, divine avatar. Ji Tianqing had used up too much of his divine power, but he could still recover it through cultivation and taking medicinal pills. His gods he used could use divine used to God s gods, swords breaking the 9 heavens. When the divine arts were broken, Ji Tianqing blocked Dao Xingyun's attack and counterattack. He waved the divine hammer with his left hand and smashed out endless lightning power. He waved the sword of burial of heaven with his right hand and stabbed out a dazzling sword light. On the surface, Dao Xingyun looked very confident, as if he had a card up his sleeve. In fact, he did not dare to be arrogant, nor did he dare to underestimate Ji Tianqing. His left hand struck out a huge fist radiance and palm shadow, while his right hand waved the divine spear to block the sword light. The two of them chased and fought in the sky. Their figures kept flashing, shifting and colliding. As the various divine arts collided, there was an earth-shattering sound. The sound waves spread across 100,000 miles. Boundless fragments of divine light exploded, forming a violent shock wave that swept out in all directions. The mountains were collapsing, the ground was breaking, and the sky was cracking and collapsing. The two experts above the peak Divine King stage started an intense fight. They fought until the sun and moon lost their light and the sky was breaking. After a short while, the sky and earth within a radius of 300,000 miles collapsed. The originally blue sky became fragmented and was filled with a large expanse of dark void. Fortunately, the heavenly strategy star was covered by the sky-shrouding formation. After the sky was broken, it wasn't corroded by the void. Otherwise, the broken sky would continue to extend and more holes would be corroded by the void. Ji Tianxing's power was restricted by the sky-shrouding formation and his fighting power was reduced. However, he still fought Dao Xingyun's God's incarnation to a draw. The two of them couldn't do anything to each other. Only their divine power was being depleted rapidly. However, the two of them kept changing their battlefield as they fought and flew at high speed in the sky. The destructive power of the battle's aftermath was very shocking. Wherever they passed, the sky collapsed and the ground caved in. The first hour was fine. The two of them passed through millions of miles of mountains and forests. However, after an hour, the two of them changed their battlefield to a divine kingdom. As a result, that divine kingdom suffered a calamity. Countless cities collapsed along with the shattering of the sky and earth. Countless living beings from other races were crushed by the flames and divine power that filled the sky. They turned into dust and merged with the sky and earth. As for the over 400 divine kings from other races, after they came out of the heavenly strategy divine residence, they followed the traces left behind by Dao Xingyun and finally caught up. In fact, when they were still 1,000,000 miles away from Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun, they didn't need to look for the clues left behind by Dao Xingyun. This was because the battlefield where Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun fought had shattered the sky and earth. It could be seen clearly from afar. Even in the starry sky, one could see through the colorful sky-shrouding formation and see the huge craters on the surface of the heavenly strategy star. As long as the over 400 divine kings weren't blind, they would definitely be able to meet up with Dao Xingyun. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. 2 hours later, the over 400 divine kings passed through the divine light that covered the sky and earth. They crossed the shattered sky and earth and void and finally arrived at the battlefield. In this period of time, the weaker mid-level divine kings had used up more than half of their divine power. Many of them were injured because of this. It couldn't be helped. Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun were both existences that surpassed peak divine kings. Even the aftershocks and shockwaves from the battle between the two of them weren't something a mid-level divine king could withstand. Only high-level divine kings were qualified to participate in this battle. Seeing the over 400 divine kings pass through the battlefield and arrive in front of him, Dao Xingyun became excited. After all, he couldn't defeat Ji Tianxing alone. With the help of so many divine kings, it was almost certain. However, when he turned his head to look, he saw that most of the mid-level divine kings were covered in wounds and looked miserable. They looked exhausted and exhausted. His face instantly turned black. A bunch of trash. You haven't even joined the battle and you're already in such a state. Dao Xingyun cursed softly as his eyes shone with a cold light. In order to maintain his gentle image and not disappoint the divine kings, he didn't curse out loud. Even if he cursed softly, the divine kings wouldn't hear him. Chapter 40-36. The battle between Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun was still ongoing. Of course, the battlefield was also constantly shifting. It moved 20,000 miles per second and flew across the sky. More than 400 foreign race godly kings caught up while panting. After seeing the situation clearly, they were somewhat hesitant. Domain Master, are we really going to attack? My lord, look. Their divine powers can shatter heaven and earth. Once we come into contact with them, we will be smashed into pieces. Not to mention their divine powers, even the aftershock of their battle can destroy heaven and earth. When we passed through the shattered heaven and earth, many of our brothers were injured by the aftershock. Domain Master, please reconsider. Why don't we stop attacking and form an encirclement on the outside to help Lord Supreme Martial Artist? Yes, this is a good suggestion. Since we have to participate in the battle and do our best to help Lord Supreme, we can't die in vain. Many foreign race godly kings surrounded the heavenly strategy Domain Master and discussed. Most of them were worried and fearful of Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun's methods. After all, the divine powers and the aftershock of their attacks did not differentiate between friend and foe. They destroyed everything indiscriminately. It was only when a clever guy suggested the idea of encirclement and holding the array that the godly kings heaved a sigh of relief and nodded their heads in agreement. However, no one noticed that the heavenly strategy Domain Master's face was very dark, and his eyes were burning with anger. Bastards! You cowardly bastards! Obviously, the heavenly strategy Domain Master was forcefully suppressing his anger as he cursed and roared in his heart. Do you think Lord Supreme is a fool? Do you think Lord Supreme can't see that you are so timid? If you really do this, I'm afraid Lord Supreme will kill all of you after killing Kenshin. After roaring inwardly for a while, the region master of the heavenly stratagem domain shouted with a strong sense of righteousness, "My brothers, our supreme master is fighting a bloody battle, and is valiantly killing the enemies. How can we shrink back? No matter how strong the enemy is, Lord Supreme is suppressing him. You don't have to be afraid. We have strength in numbers. As long as we work together and fight together, we will definitely be able to help Lord Supreme kill the enemy. Everyone, listen up. Charge with me." After an impassioned shout, the Heavenly Policy Region Master waved his divine sword and gave the order to attack. He pointed his sword at Ji Tianxing, who was in the middle of the battlefield, and shouted out words that made people's blood boil. Many high god kings and brave and loyal god kings all charged out like a flood. However, the region master of the Heavenly Strategies region stood at his original spot, and there were more than 200 mid-level god kings who were hesitating. When the Heavenly Stratagem region lord saw that the flood had lost its tail, he turned his head and looked behind him. He discovered that more than 200 god kings were staring at him. Suddenly, everyone felt very awkward. The Heavenly Policy Region Master was so angry that his face turned ashen. He waved his sword again and roared, "Bastard! What are you waiting for? Charge!" Charge. Those mid-level god kings, who were riddled with scars and in a sorry state, looked left and right. They pretended to charge, but they couldn't take a single step. Even though some clever people shouted "charge," and looked as if their blood had rushed to their heads, they didn't move at all. The region master of the Heavenly Stratagem region was so angry that he could only roar fiercely, "I will lead the charge. If anyone dares to slack off, don't blame me for chopping off his dog head first." The region master of the Heavenly Stratagem region master had no choice but to shout again. He took the lead and charged out. Seeing him brandish his sword and charge into the battlefield to kill Ji Tianxing, only then did the 200 or so middle divine kings slowly follow him. Even though they were shouting blood-boiling slogans, their formation was loose and their morale was low. All of them were hiding and cowering. If it weren't for the sake of stabilizing the morale of the army, the region master of the Heavenly Stratagem region master would have executed them on the spot. Even though half of the foreign race's god kings were afraid and didn't dare to surround and attack Ji Tianxing. However, The other half of the God Kings, who were hot-blooded and impulsive, actually surrounded Ji Tianqing and attacked him without any regard for their own safety. When Ji Tianqing was fighting with Dao Xingyun, he was suppressed by the heaven-shrouding formation. Now that he was surrounded by 200 God Kings, he was in imminent danger. He could only retreat with all his might. Even with the protection of the indestructible golden body and the primordial chaos bell, he couldn't hold on much longer. Fortunately, the heaven-shrouding formation's formless energy wasn't just suppressing him. It was also suppressing the other foreign races' God Kings, greatly weakening their strength. Ji Tianqing stimulated his potential and unleashed 120% of his strength. He finally escaped from the encirclement. Dao Xingyun chased after him relentlessly and kept attacking him. The 400 or so God Kings followed behind as well. They pursued relentlessly until their last breath. Ji Tianqing felt a headache coming on, but he didn't have a good solution. After thinking about it, he decided to continue stalling for time and lengthen the battle line before trying to defeat them one by one. The so-called defeat them one by one referred to him exhausting Dao Xingyun to death first. When Dao Xingyun's strength was exhausted and his avatar collapsed, he would deal with the Heavenly Strategy Region Lord and the few hundred God Kings. This was the only way out. However, it had to be built on the basis that he had sufficient divine power and a strong foundation. From the current situation, the success rate was less than 20%. At this moment, Burial of Heaven's voice sounded in his mind. This can't go on. I have a suggestion. Seeing that Burial of Heaven had thought of a solution, Ji Tianqing hurriedly used his divine perception to ask, "What idea do you have?" Burial of Heaven didn't waste any time. He said in a low voice, "I will stay. You lure Dao Xingyun away. After the battle line is lengthened, I will attack with everyone and ambush those God Kings." Ji Tianqing understood immediately. Burial of Heaven was referring to Yun Yao, Jiku, Bai Feng, and the others when he said everyone. By doing this, he wanted to split the battlefield into two and defeat them one by one. This idea is feasible, but it's also very dangerous. Although these God Kings are weak, there are too many of them. I'm afraid you won't be able to hold them off. Ji Tianqing frowned and said worriedly. Burial of Heaven said firmly, "This is the most suitable and most promising method. Don't worry, I will do my best to protect everyone. Once they can't hold on, I will bring them away in time." Ji Tianqing thought for a moment and agreed. He used his divine perception to inform Yun Yao, Jiku, and the others and told them the plan. Yun Yao, Jiku, and the others had fought a huge battle previously. They had lost some of their strength and suffered injuries of varying degrees. But now, 4 hours had passed in the outside world. They had been recuperating in the distorted spacetime for 8 days. Everyone's injuries and strength had recovered by 80% to 90%. They could fight again. After hearing Ji Tianqing's plan, everyone agreed. Hence, Ji Tianqing and Dao Xingyun exchanged 2 moves and pretended that Burial of Heaven's sword had been sent flying. The divine sword rolled and smashed thousands of miles away. It turned into a ray of black light and fell from the sky. Then, it disappeared and hid in an alternate space. Chapter 40-37. Seeing the sword of Burial of Heaven fall from the sky, Ji Tianqing's eyes flashed with a hint of panic, and he subconsciously wanted to pick it up. However, Dao Xingyun revealed a smug sneer. He immediately waved the silver dragon divine spear to block Ji Tianqing and took the opportunity to counterattack. Left with no other choice, Ji Tianqing was forced to defend himself and retreat step by step as he fled into the distance. Naturally, he couldn't pick up the sword of Burial of Heaven that had fallen from the sky. One of his swords had been shot down, and he had lost a suitable weapon. His battle prowess had naturally decreased. Dao Xingyun became more and more confident. He saw the dawn of defeating Ji Tianqing, and he increased the pace of his attacks. Thus, Ji Tianqing could only increase his speed and escape, and he was exhausted from defending against Dao Xingyun's fierce attacks. Even the 400-plus foreign race god-kings became spirited when they saw this scene. They were full of confidence as they increased the speed of their pursuit. As for the sword of burial of heaven that had fallen from the sky and disappeared into thin air, no one paid any attention to it. Perhaps there were a few foreign race god-kings who thought of picking up that divine sword and taking it for themselves. However, they didn't dare to leave the group and pick up the sword of burial of heaven in front of everyone. They could only suppress their greed and chase after Ji Tianxing with the heavenly strategy region master. No one knew that the sword of burial of heaven that had disappeared into thin air was hiding in an alternate space and observing for a moment. It only appeared again after the group of god-kings flew 100,000 miles away. It secretly followed behind the group of god-kings, looking for an opportunity to attack. Of course, everyone was immersed in the joy and anticipation of pursuing the enemy while they were victorious. No one cared that the group of god-kings was being left further and further behind, and that they were gradually losing touch with Dao Xingyun. As a matter of fact, even the group of over 400 foreign god-kings grew longer and longer before they knew it. It couldn't be helped. The strength of these god-kings was different, and their flying speed was also different. Some were more severely injured, some were less injured, and some weren't that injured. This also affected their flying speed. About 15 minutes later, the Divine King's army stretched to about 50,000 miles, and was divided into 5 groups. At the same time, they were left behind by Dao Xingyun by more than 200,000 miles. They could no longer see the figures of Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun. They could only see the sky in front of them constantly shattering and dazzling divine light shining. At this moment, something unexpected happened. At the very back of the group of god-kings, a streak of white light suddenly flashed through the originally shattered and empty sky. It was the sword of burial of heaven. It had sped up and caught up to the god-king's team. Swish, swish. As the white light flickered, the world in the sword opened. Figures flew out and appeared in the sky. Yunyao, Jiku, Baifeng, Chao Qingyu, Lan Yank, one after another, god-king experts appeared, brimming with energy and killing intent. Ji Tianxing wasn't present. This battle was led by the sword of burial of heaven. It was the first to charge into the god-king's team, causing a bloody scene. Following that, Jiku wielded the 9 heavens 10 absolutes pagoda in his left hand and brandished his divine spear in his right hand. He unleashed his nirvana flames and killed many foreign god-kings. Yunyao, Baifeng, Chao Qingyu, and company followed closely behind. They unleashed their most powerful attacks, dealing fatal blows to the foreign god-kings. Apart from killing enemies, the sword of burial of heaven was also responsible for supporting everyone. As for Jiku, apart from killing enemies, he also used his intrinsic divine artifact, the 9 heavens 10 absolutes pagoda, to save everyone at critical moments. As the strongest person in the group, Baifeng also unleashed her heavenly phoenix shadow. She transformed into a white heavenly phoenix that blotted out the sky and released the most violent divine flames. Since it was a surprise attack, everyone didn't hold back. They unleashed all their potential and strength. Their goal was to kill as many foreign race god-kings as possible in the shortest amount of time. Swish, 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 bam, 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 bam. The dozens of foreign god-kings at the back of the group were the weakest mid-level god-kings to begin with. Furthermore, they were all severely injured. They weren't on guard at all. Suddenly, an expert attacked from the back of the group. As a result, by the time they recovered from their shock, it was already too late for them to dodge. Following an earth-shattering explosion, waves of blood gushed out from the group of foreign god-kings. Destructive divine light shockwaves burst forth. Saber lights and sword shadows flashed, and 5 colored flames soared. In just one exchange, more than 20 foreign god-kings were blasted into pieces. Broken limbs and blood rained down. After 2 breaths, the foreign god-kings regained their senses. They shouted and roared angrily as they launched a counterattack. However, Yun Yao, Jiku, and company's momentum had already been built. They charged forward with unstoppable momentum. With the sword of Burial of Heaven as the vanguard, they formed a sharp blade and ruthlessly stabbed into the foreign god kings, tearing them apart. Bam! 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 Boom! Boom! Loud noises rose and fell one after another, lingering in the ears. The foreign god kings' screams didn't stop either. As the waves of blood surged, many foreign god kings were smashed into pieces and turned into ashes. The outcome was already decided. After 100 breaths, this ferocious attack came to an end. 47 foreign god kings who were severely injured and weaker were all killed by the group. Not a single one survived. At this moment, the group of god kings 20,000 miles ahead had already realized that the situation behind them was not good. When they saw a group of god kings appear out of thin air behind them and kill more than 40 of their comrades like they were chopping vegetables, they were also shocked. However, after they calmed down and observed carefully, they realized that Yun Yao, Jiku, and company's cultivation realms were not high. Other than Baifeng, who was a high-level god king, the rest were mid-level and low-level god kings. Such weak cultivation realms dispelled their worries and made them feel much more relaxed. As for the fact that more than 40 of their comrades were killed, they didn't think that Yun Yao and company were that powerful. It was just that their comrades were severely injured and were caught off guard when they were ambushed. Very soon, this group of god kings turned around and charged towards Yun Yao and company. There were a total of more than 100 foreign god kings. They were filled with excitement and joy as they charged over with murderous intent. Although they were about to fight a huge battle, they weren't flustered at all. In fact, they were very happy and excited. They were actually grateful for the appearance of Yun Yao, Jiku, and company. After all, they finally had something to do. They didn't have to participate in the battle between Dao Xingyun and Ji Tianxing. They just had to surround and kill a dozen or so weak god kings. It was simply too easy. Both sides had yet to fight, but many of the foreign god kings were already planning not to use too much strength later. They had to take it easy. This was to prevent them from killing Yun Yao and company in 3 to 5 moves. They wouldn't be able to stall for time and would have to surround and attack Ji Tianxing. Many of the foreign god kings had this thought. They had a tacit understanding. However, Yun Yao, Jiku, and company reacted very quickly. Seeing nearly 100 foreign god kings charging over, Jiku made a prompt decision to activate the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda and put everyone into the distorted spacetime. Then, she brought the pagoda into the sword world. The Burial of Heaven sword that was ready to attack disappeared with a flash of light. It had hidden itself again. Chapter 4038. The Sword of Burial of Heaven was not a supreme-grade king-level divine artifact. However, it was more than enough to deal with those middle-level and upper-level foreign race godly kings. Most importantly, it was even more special than supreme-grade divine artifact. That was because it had a complete sword soul and had its own consciousness. It used the divine sword's power to hide in an alternate dimension, completely isolating the hundreds of foreign race godly kings from probing. This move was very beautiful, instantly causing those godly kings to miss their target. Ah! Damn it! Where did they go? They were still here just now. Why did they all disappear with a flash of light? Where did they hide? Why can't I detect them with my divine consciousness? Everyone be careful of traps. Don't panic. Search carefully. The foreign race godly kings who were still excited and fighting bravely immediately quieted down. Everyone stood in the sky and looked around in confusion, searching for something in all directions. However, the Sword of Burial of Heaven had already passed through the alternate dimension and left this place. It flew 50,000 miles at an extremely fast speed and caught up with another group of foreign race godly kings. This group had more than 70 people, and they were basically middle-level godly kings. Moreover, their injuries were relatively light. Although these godly kings were definitely more difficult to deal with. However, this group was focused on traveling and did not notice the abnormality behind them. They also did not know that more than 40 of their comrades had been killed. In other words, these godly kings were not on guard at all. Swish! When no one was paying attention, the sword of burial of heaven escaped from the alternate dimension and appeared on the right side of the group. With a flash of white light, the world within the sword opened. Jiku appeared high in the sky with the 9 heavens 10 absolutes pagoda. The sword of burial of heaven exploded with the fastest speed and the sharpest sword energy as it charged into the group of godly kings. Jiku also opened the 9 heavens 10 absolutes pagoda and released Yun Yao, Chao Qingyu, and the others. Everyone used the same trick and used their trump cards to attack the foreign race godly kings in front of them. Bam! 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 Boom! Boom! The scene from before played out once again. Saber lights and sword shadows covered the shattered sky. Dazzling multicolored divine flames and glazed flames poured down like a flood. The shattered sky was instantly filled with dazzling divine light. Following a series of loud noises, destructive shock waves spread out in all directions. As soon as the two sides clashed, 2 alien god kings were insta-killed by the burial of heaven. Soon after, even more foreign race god kings were killed by Bai Feng, Yun Yao, and the others. The group's sneak attack was indeed effective. Many foreign race god kings came back to their senses and immediately began to counterattack. The curtains of a great battle of daggers clashing against each other thus began. The Heaven Burier sword continued to charge forward. It was like a black streak of death as it shot through the battlefield, killing foreign god kings one after another. Every single god king that was struck by the black sword light had their heads smashed and their godheads destroyed. However, no matter how domineering and sharp it was, there would be a time when its power would weaken. After charging forward more than 10 times and killing 22 foreign race god kings, its aura weakened and its power decreased. At this moment, more than 20 foreign race god kings pounced over and surrounded it. Seeing that a divine sword that no one was controlling could move freely and unleash the battle prowess of a high-level god king, everyone was extremely shocked. However, they were also very curious and interested. Many of the foreign race god kings that surrounded it revealed greedy expressions. They looked at the sword of burial of heaven with burning gazes. Although they knew that the sword of burial of heaven was very dangerous, they could not restrain themselves. However, they were still unable to restrain themselves. They really wanted to obtain this mystical divine weapon. The sword of burial of heaven knew that it would be very difficult for it to break free even if it tried its best to break free. Thus, it played along and pretended that it was not strong enough. Soon, it was captured by 2 god kings. The 2 god kings used their capturing techniques and caught it at the same time. Although it struggled desperately, it could not escape from the 2 god kings' imprisonment. It could not help but let out a sword hum. Seeing this, the 2 god kings felt their blood boil. They did not hesitate to snatch the sword of burial of heaven for themselves. However, the 2 foreign race god kings were evenly matched when they attacked at the same time. As soon as they saw this, the surrounding alien god kings were all stunned. They had never thought that their own people would actually start a fight over a divine sword. However, after thinking about it carefully, they did not feel that there was any problem. Because if they were the ones who caught the sword of burial of heaven, they would also take it for themselves. Thinking of this, more than 20 foreign race god kings' eyes burned with passion. They had made up their minds. If the 2 Star Lords failed in their fight and the divine sword escaped, they would definitely snatch it. In any case, according to the heavenly strategies Starfield's usual practice, such spoils of war belonged to whoever managed to snatch them. Let go of this king! Star-Lord Santua, it was clearly this king who caught it first. Nonsense! It was this king who made the first move and caught this divine weapon. You! Then it belongs to whoever snatches it. Strength speaks for itself. When the two Star Lords fought over the sword of burial of heaven, they did not forget to argue, but it was to no avail. The two continued to fight with all their strength. Finally, not far away, a God King who was on good terms with Star Lord Santua's secretly helped him. Whoosh! Star Lord Santua's strength increased greatly, and he snatched the sword of burial of heaven on the spot. The other Star Lord's giant palm of divine light directly collapsed, and he was also knocked back a few hundred meters. He was so angry that his face turned black, and his body surged with killing intent. However, he could not kill his colleague in front of so many people for a divine sword. He could only grit his teeth and swallow this humiliation back into his stomach. After successfully snatching the sword of burial of heaven, Star Lord Santua excitedly raised the sword of burial of heaven and showed it to his colleague. He excitedly shouted, "This divine weapon belongs to this king." However, just as he finished speaking, the sword of burial of heaven, which had dimmed and weakened, suddenly released a dazzling sword light. Whoosh! The sword of burial of heaven unleashed its full power and instantly pierced through Star Lord Santua's skull, shattering his mind and divine spark. Star Lord Santua was frozen on the spot. The vitality in his eyes disappeared, and he died on the spot. At this moment, the sword of burial of heaven turned into a streak of black light and escaped the encirclement while the God Kings were still in shock. After 1 second, everyone realized what had happened and immediately exclaimed and roared. Star Lord Santua is dead. Be careful, everyone. That divine sword is very strange. It's not weakened yet. It was just pretending to be weak. Don't be fooled by it. Oh my God! How can a sword be so cunning and capable? What kind of weapon is that? How can it be so smart? Although it's not an ultra-quality divine artifact, it seems to be alive and intelligent. It's definitely more valuable than an ultra-quality divine artifact. Everyone, chase it. We can't let it escape. As everyone shouted, more than 20 God Kings of other races chased after the sword of burial of heaven. Not far away, the dozens of God Kings who were besieging Yunyao, Jiku, and the others were fuming with anger, but there was nothing they could do. Chapter 40-39. We were all attacking these dozen or so godly kings and the two divine beasts. Yet, you bastards only care about snatching that divine sword? Damn bastards! I will definitely report this to the Domain Lord later and let her punish you severely. These thoughts flashed through the minds of the dozens of godly kings who were attacking Yun Yao and the others, and they became even angrier. However, they could not leave their posts, nor could they join in the commotion and chase after the sword of the burial of heaven. They could only grit their teeth and use all their skills to attack Yun Yao and the others. However, Jiku used the power of the 9 heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda and formed a shield with 5 colored flames to protect everyone. The divine arts cast by the dozens of foreign race God Kings landed on the barrier, but they were completely ineffective. Instead, Yun Yao, Jiku, and the others' counterattacks landed on the crowd and caused a large number of casualties. The two sides fought high up in the sky for 100 breaths of time. Yun Yao, Jiku, Baifeng, and the others were all injured. Their hair and robes were dyed red with blood. However, the dozens of godly kings suffered even more casualties. More than 20 of them were killed and another 20 were injured. If the battle continued, the remaining 20 or so godly kings would be killed by Yun Yao and the others sooner or later. At this moment, the 100-man team from behind rushed over to support the surviving godly kings. Seeing that the situation was not good, Jiku decisively used the 9 heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda and pulled everyone into the distorted spacetime. The intense battle just now came to an abrupt end just like that. Jiku also hid in the pagoda and used his mind to control the pagoda. He turned into a black light and fled into the distance. A moment later, the sword of the burial of heaven killed 2 godly kings and met up with the 9 heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda. Swoosh! A white light flashed, and the pagoda entered the sword world. The sword of the burial of heaven disappeared in front of everyone's eyes again. When the hundreds of godly kings rushed over, they missed again. Everyone was shocked and angry. They were so angry that they cursed and roared angrily. They had never thought that a mysterious black sword would be so cunning and difficult to deal with. At the critical moment, a white-haired, experienced Star Lord made a suggestion calmly. "We can't go on like this. We can't trap that divine sword, but it's possible that it will kill us all one by one. We must report this to the Domain Lord and request the Domain Lord to take action. Everyone will join forces to destroy that divine sword and those dozen or so foreign race god kings." The 100 or so foreign god kings in the surroundings all calmed down from their greed and excitement. Everyone logically agreed with the white-haired Star-Lord's suggestion. Although they all wanted to obtain the divine sword, they wanted to preserve their lives even more. Schwa. Seeing that everyone agreed, the white-haired Astral Lord took out a messaging jade strip and sent a message to the Heavenly Strategy Domain Master, who was 80,000 kilometers away. At the same time, the Region Master of the Heavenly Strategies region was leading over 60 high-level God Kings in pursuit of Ji Tianxing. This team was at the forefront, the closest to Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun. They were only about 35,000 kilometers away. The Region Master of the Heavenly Strategies region and these high-level God Kings were charging with all their might and would soon catch up with Ji Tianxing. However, they were obviously holding back. They kept following behind, pretending that they could not catch up with Dao Xingyun and Ji Tianxing. These people were not stupid. They were all cautious. They did not want to be punished by Dao Xingyun, but they also did not want to confront Ji Tianxing head-on. They only hoped that Dao Xingyun would kill Ji Tianxing as soon as possible and end this battle. At this moment, the Region Master of the Heavenly Strategies region received the white-haired Star-Lord's message. He immediately fell into a dilemma. A few of his trusted subordinates beside him saw his hesitation and asked, "Region Master, what happened? Is there anything we can do for you? Is there anything we can help you with?" The Region Master of the Heavenly Strategies region did not hide anything from them. He said truthfully, a divine sword appeared behind the team. There were also a dozen of foreign races God Kings. They have already killed dozens of our brothers. I am considering whether to continue chasing Kenshin or to deal with that divine sword. These subordinates were not stupid. While they were shocked, they also suddenly understood. A divine sword? Was it Kenshin's sword that was knocked away by Lord Supreme? The Region Master of the Heavenly Strategies region nodded. That trusted subordinate said with certainty, "If that's the case, then that divine sword can move freely as if it has a consciousness. It must be a peerless divine sword. Moreover, it seems that Kenshin's sword was knocked away. In fact, this might be Kenshin's scheme." After this person's reminder, the Region Master of the Heavenly Strategies region's eyes lit up. He suddenly had an idea. "Good. Then I will report this to Lord Supreme. I will now destroy that divine sword and destroy Kenshin's scheme. This can also be considered as helping Lord Supreme, right?" "Of course." His subordinates nodded in agreement. Thus, the Region Master of the Heavenly Strategies region sent a message to Dao Xingyun. After reporting the situation, he led the group of God Kings and turned around to fly back. However, after flying for tens of thousands of miles and meeting the white-haired Star Master and the other God Kings, they did not see any trace of the Sword of the Burial of Heaven. The Region Master of the Heavenly Strategies region frowned and asked in a dignified tone, "Didn't you say that you were attacked by a divine sword and a dozen foreign races God Kings? Where is that sword? Where did it go?" The white-haired Star Master's expression was bitter. He explained awkwardly, "Region Master, that divine sword is very cunning. It is hiding." The others also nodded in agreement. "Yes, that divine sword will only sneak attack us when we are unprepared. Once there are too many of us, it will run away." The region master of the Heavenly Strategies region's expression became more and more unsightly. He sneered, "It's just a weapon. Even if it has some intelligence, it can't have such intelligence and scheming. Is that sword too smart or are you too stupid?" No one could answer this question. More than 100 god kings' faces turned green. They stammered and could not explain clearly. The region master of the Heavenly Strategies region did not waste any time. He ordered in a deep voice, "Don't dawdle. Everyone, gather together and be on guard at all times. All high-level god kings, use your divine abilities and secret skills to search for the divine sword." This method was indeed the wisest. More than 300 god kings gathered together and were on guard. Of course, the sword of the burial of heaven did not know where to start. Moreover, the region master of the Heavenly Strategies region was a 9th-degree god king. Together with dozens of high-level god kings, they would definitely be able to find the sword of the burial of heaven. But the problem was that the sword of the burial of heaven had already left this place to meet up with Ji Tianxing, 500,000 miles away. Ji Tianxing and Dao Xingyun were still fighting. They quickly moved the battlefield, leaving behind fragments of heaven and earth along the way. Until now, the two of them were still in a stalemate. Neither of them was injured. But Dao Xingyun was full of confidence. He wanted to further undermine Ji Tianxing's confidence. He mocked and ridiculed, "As a Kenshin, you can't even hold your sword and were even sent flying. Kenshin, you don't deserve this name. Either change your name or kill yourself." Ji Tianxing sensed the sword of the burial of heaven approaching quickly. The corner of his mouth hooked up into a playful smile. "The highest realm of the sword Dao is to have no sword in hand and the world is a sword. I don't need a sword to kill you. What's more, my sword is back." Chapter 40. When Dao Xingyun heard the first two sentences, he felt that it was true. Although he didn't major in sword Dao, he also believed that Ji Tianxing's words were the truth of sword Dao. But the last sentence made him freeze on the spot. "Your sword is back?" Dao Xingyun didn't know how to react. He thought that the sword had already been sent flying and fell hundreds of thousands of miles away. How could it be back? But a thought flashed through his mind, and he suddenly recalled the events from 1,000 years ago. Instantly, his body shook and disbelief shot out of his eyes. "Your sword, burial of heaven, is also resurrected?" As one of the 5 people who besieged Kenshin and killed Kenshin, he naturally knew that Kenshin's sword was called Burial of Heaven. And in that Burial of Heaven sword there was a sword soul called Burial of Heaven. The sword's soul had spirituality and wisdom. However, after Kenshin died, the 5 god emperors personally destroyed the Burial of Heaven sword. Everyone believed that the Burial of Heaven sword was completely destroyed and couldn't be restored. Even when he saw Kenshin being resurrected and returning with an identical Burial of Heaven sword, Dao Xingyun thought that it was a replica. After all, Kenshin being resurrected was shocking enough. How could the Burial of Heaven sword that had been destroyed for 1,000 years reappear? Now that he heard this sentence, he finally reacted. If the Burial of Heaven sword could return to Ji Tianxing's hands, it must be because of the Burial of Heaven sword's soul. As expected, what happened next confirmed Dao Xingyun's guess. Swoosh! A black light flew from the shattered sky and landed in Ji Tianxing's hands. Dao Xingyun looked over. It was the sword of Burial of Heaven. Seeing the Burial of Heaven sword fly back with his own eyes, he could no longer suppress the shock in his heart. He exclaimed in disbelief, "It really is the Burial of Heaven. It had been destroyed for 1,000 years, so how could it be revived? Kenshin, how did you do it?" Ji Tianxing held the godly hammer in his left hand and the sword of Burial of Heaven in his right. He had regained his previous aura. Since the existence of the Burial of Heaven had been exposed, he no longer had to pretend to be weak. You want to know? Then I'll let you do it personally." He sneered and didn't say anything else. He waved his divine hammer and the sword of burial of heaven and launched a fierce attack on Dao Xingyun. Life and death of the Thunder Sea. Sword of destruction. The godly hammer shot out billions of lightning bolts, forming a colorful sea of lightning that rained down on Dao Xingyun. The sword of burial of heaven absorbed the power of the 5 elements world and formed a giant golden sword that was tens of thousands of feet long. It slashed down from the sky. After fighting for so long, Ji Tianxing knew that it was time to end it. The burial of heaven had already told him about the situation of the foreign races' godly kings behind him. This was the best time to defeat them one by one. Rumble! Kaboom! Amidst the earth-shattering thunder, Dao Xingyun formed a divine seal with both hands and released the power of the heavenly Dao. It formed a shield around his body to resist the corrosion of the sea of lightning. No matter how violent the divine lightning was, it couldn't break through his shield of the heavenly Dao. Although Dao Xingyun would consume too much energy by doing so, it would accelerate the exhaustion of his energy. However, this was the safest and one of his most powerful defensive methods. After blocking the corrosion of the sea of lightning, Dao Xingyun waved the silver dragon divine spear with both hands, thrusting out spear shadows to block the sword of destruction. He could feel that the sword of destruction was formed by a powerful force comparable to the power of the heavenly Dao. It was extremely terrifying. He didn't expect the silver dragon divine spear to be able to defeat the sword of destruction. He only hoped to reduce the power of the sword light. In addition to his shield of the heavenly Dao, he would definitely be able to withstand this sword. However, he still underestimated the power of the sword of destruction. Bam! 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 Hundreds of silver dragon spear shadows crashed into the sword of destruction, but they couldn't withstand a single blow and collapsed. On the other hand, the sword of destruction's power and speed didn't decrease. It was still dazzling with golden light as it slashed down. Kaboom! Finally, the giant golden sword that was tens of thousands of feet long struck Dao Xingyun. It wasn't that he didn't want to dodge, but the sword qi and invisible suppressive force had already firmly restrained him. Moreover, he had the shield of the heavenly Dao, so he was 80% confident. However, the reality was beyond his expectations. Amidst an earth-shattering sound, the shield formed by the heavenly Dao was actually broken by the giant sword. At that moment, Dao Xingyun's eyes widened, and his pupils constricted. Deep shock filled his heart. He finally realized that the special force that formed this sword light was the legendary power of the world. It was the magical power that could create everything and evolve the entire world from nothing. In the ancient legends, it was the power of the Creator, and it was comparable to the power of the heavenly Dao. It's over. I've overestimated myself. Dao Xingyun suddenly regretted it, but it was already too late. The dazzling golden sword light drowned his body. His sturdy and broad arm was instantly severed by the sword light, and a pile of debris splattered everywhere. This was an avatar, not a body of flesh and blood, so there was naturally no scene of blood splattering everywhere. However, Dao Xingyun's entire right arm was severed, and his arm shattered into pieces, splattering everywhere. Such a scene still sent chills down one's spine. In the next moment, the power of the sword light completely exploded, and Dao Xingyun was sent flying, rolling and crashing thousands of miles away. Ah! You deserve to die. Dao Xingyun, who was shocked and angry, let out a low roar like muffled thunder. This was the first time he had been injured in the battle with Ji Tianxing. Moreover, the injury was so serious that it accelerated the loss of his power, and his strength was also weakened. Ji Tianxing took the opportunity to chase after Dao Xingyun and sneered. I've already said that your avatar will definitely die. Are you angry? Do you want to take revenge? Then let your real body come here personally. He had angered Dao Xingyun again because he wanted to test what Dao Xingyun's real body was doing. How important was it? Although the avatar of the god of the underworld had been destroyed, and the real body had not come to take revenge. He was already confident. However, Dao Xingyun's reaction confirmed his guess even more. As expected, Dao Xingyun shut up when he mentioned that his real body would come here personally. When he was sent flying for 800 miles, Ji Tianxing arrived in front of him again and slashed down with his sword again. Sword breaking 9 heavens. Next, the two of them fought fiercely in the sky and continued to move the battlefield. Although it was very difficult for ordinary sword skills to hurt Dao Xingyun, this could accelerate the depletion of Dao Xingyun's power and make his injuries worsen. Ji Tianxing also could not continuously use the Sword of Destruction in a short period of time. He needed some buffer time. In White Dragon's words, it was called skill cooldown. Finally, after the two of them fought for another 15 minutes, they moved the battlefield millions of miles away. At this moment, the region master of heavenly strategies caught up with more than 300 god kings. Ji Tianxing waved the burial of heaven again and used the Sword of Destruction. Dao Xingyun had not been able to dodge the previous sword strike. Now that he was severely injured and weak, it was even more impossible for him to dodge this attack. Boom! Crack! Under the gaze of hundreds of foreign race god kings, the huge golden sword slashed down on Dao Xingyun. Everyone saw with their own eyes that Dao Xingyun's body collapsed under the sword light. He was split into two, and countless fragments flew out. Those fragments scattered in the shattered world, turned into pure divine power, and quickly dissipated. Instantly, everyone was dumbfounded. Chapter 40-41. For hundreds of years, the Heavenly Strategy Region Master and the other godly kings had held Lord Ji Zun in high esteem. In their knowledge, Lord Ji Zun was a supreme expert who had surpassed the godly king realm and was unparalleled. After witnessing what had happened today, the illusions and reverence in their hearts were shattered. First, Lord Ji Zun fought with Kenshin, who was a peak godly king. After fighting for so long, Lord Ji Zun was still unable to kill Kenshin, which made everyone feel surprised and disappointed. Then, thousands of miles of heaven and earth were shattered, and countless innocent people died. Lord Ji Zun could not do anything to Kenshin. Now it was even more ridiculous. Lord Ji Zun was hacked into pieces by Kenshin. The Heavenly Strategy Region Master and the other godly kings could not believe this scene. They could not accept that Lord Ji Zun, who was above the godly king realm, could not even defeat Kenshin, who was a peak godly king. Could it be that Kenshin had also surpassed the godly king realm and reached Lord Ji Zun's realm? No. Lord Ji Zun was also a peak godly king. He was not a Ji Zun. He had lied and deceived everyone. This thought flashed through the minds of the Heavenly Strategy Region Master and the other godly kings at the same time, and they believed it without a doubt. Their spiritual pillar had collapsed, and so did their faith and courage. Everyone was stunned as they looked at the pieces flying in the sky and fusing with the heaven and earth. They were not sad, and they forgot about their fear. They were only shocked and in disbelief, and their expressions were complicated. Until the pieces in the sky dissipated, and the loud noise between heaven and earth disappeared. Ji Tianxing held the godly hammer and the sword of burial of heaven, and turned to look at the crowd. Only then did they regain their senses. Although Ji Tianxing did not do anything, his cold expression and the murderous aura that had not dissipated from his body gave the other godly kings a fright. Lord Ji Zun is dead. Everyone, run! Even Lord Ji Zun could not defeat Kenshin. We are no match for him. Don't seek your own death. It's over. We can't escape this calamity. Lord Ji Zun, please think of a way. Don't hesitate, run! Kenshin is not alone. He has more than 10 companions. The god kings of other races who were filled with fear and anxiety all let out cries and shouts. A commotion broke out in the crowd. The god kings around the Heavenly Stratagem Region Master were still fine. Even though they were anxious and flustered, they didn't dare to run away. They all looked at the Region Master and waited for him to make a decision. However, at the very back of the group, The weaker and more heavily injured foreign god-kings were already retreating. They were prepared to flee. This scene was rather comical and absurd. Over 300 divine king powerhouses were actually frightened to such an extent when facing Ji Tianqing alone, ready to flee at any time. This was simply inconceivable, extremely humiliating, and laughable. The Heavenly Policy Region Master's expression was extremely ugly. He was both indignant and helpless. He looked around and glanced at the foreign god-kings. He growled angrily, "What are you afraid of?" He was alone, so what was there to be afraid of? Don't forget, we still have over 300 people. A large number of ants can kill an elephant. If each of us stab him with a knife or a sword, it would be enough to kill him 10 times. What's more, he has been fighting with Lord Supreme Martial Artist for so long. He's already a spent force. Hearing his words, the god-kings felt their faces burning. They all felt guilty and ashamed. At the same time, they regained some of their confidence. Even the god-kings at the back of the group, who were about to run away, stopped in their tracks. They looked very hesitant. The region master struck while the iron was hot. He shouted in an impassioned tone, "Everyone, my brothers! This is the Heavenly Policy Star, our territory and home. We have nowhere to run, so we must protect its integrity and safety. Only if we join forces to kill Kenshin will everyone have a chance to live. Otherwise, everyone will be killed by him, and the entire Heavenly Policy Star field will be plunged into chaos. I believe that all of you know how serious the consequences are. Therefore, I ask that all of you follow me and join forces for one last time. If we can't win this battle, we will all be buried here." As soon as he finished speaking, the Heavenly Strategy Region Lord brandished his divine sword and took the lead to charge towards Ji Tianqing. He shouted loudly, and his body burst out with blazing killing intent. It was like a ball of flame that streaked across the sky. More than a dozen of his trusted generals also raised their divine weapons and shouted hot-blooded slogans as they charged with him. Not far from him, many god-kings were affected by his aura. They were also hot-blooded as they roared and attacked. However, the human heart was the most complicated, and it was also the hardest to reach a consensus. Among the 300 god-kings, 70% of them were hot-blooded warriors. However, there were still over 100 cowards. When over 200 god-kings roared and charged forward, surrounding Ji Tianqing, there were over 100 god-kings who turned around and fled. They sped up and fled into the distance. These god-kings who were running away were not stupid. They did not go back the way they came, and they would not run back to the Heavenly Policy Divine Abode. They split into several groups and fled in different directions. Their goal was the same, which was to get away from Ji Tianqing and hide in a safe place. Then, they would try to escape from the Heavenly Policy Star and return to the stars they ruled. Swish, 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 swish. Over 100 divine lights streaked across the sky and quickly disappeared into the horizon. The Heavenly Strategy Region Master and more than 200 divine kings had just formed a circle and surrounded Ji Tianqing. When the Region Master saw the 100 god kings running away, he was so angry that his face turned ashen and his body trembled. He wished that he could chase after them and capture them to behead them in front of everyone. However, those people ran very quickly and had already disappeared without a trace. The Region Master and more than 200 god kings had already started fighting with Ji Tianqing. They could not leave at all. Under such circumstances, he could only forcefully suppress his anger and remain calm. He swore in his heart that if he could kill Kenshin today and survive, he would definitely find those deserters and behead them in public. Rumble! Bam! 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 More than 260 god kings of other races used all kinds of divine abilities and ultimate skills to surround and attack Ji Tianqing. Divine techniques that blotted out the sky, sword and saber lights that blotted out the sky, as well as wind, fire, and lightning poured down like a torrential flood. Ji Tianqing's figure was drowned by all kinds of divine techniques, and a series of muffled sounds could be heard. On the surface, this battlefield covered an area of tens of thousands of miles. Heaven and earth were drowned in divine light, and it was extremely shocking. However, in reality, Ji Tianqing was completely unharmed under the intense tremors of heaven and earth. He had the protection of the primordial chaos bell and the indestructible golden body, so he could block 99% of the divine technique. Occasionally, there were divine techniques that he could not block, but when they landed on his body, they were like tickles. After a while, Ji Tianqing blocked the first wave of attacks from the God Kings and took the opportunity to counterattack. He let out a low roar and unleashed his ultimate trump card, the 10-directional vanishing shadows. 9 clones appeared around him. Swish, swish, swish. The 9 clones appeared in the sky and brandished the divine hammer and the sword of burial of heaven respectively as they attacked the surrounding God Kings. Chapter 40-42. Each of Ji Tianqing's doppelgangers had the battle prowess of a peak divine king. They could hold their own. Each doppelganger could deal with more than 20 divine kings of the foreign races. They could even kill those divine kings one by one without being defeated. The 9 doppelgangers had arranged for more than 200 divine kings of the foreign races. As for Ji Tianqing's main body, he was only going for the Heavenly Strategy Region Master. His goal was to kill the Heavenly Strategy Region Master first. The Heavenly Strategy Region Master was surrounded by 12 of his trusted subordinates. These subordinates were either the Heavenly Strategy Divine Residence's guard commanders, great generals, or the Star Lord of a certain star. The 12 of them were all high-level divine kings. They were brave, battle-hardened, and had a strong will to fight. Seeing Ji Tianqing charging at them, the 12 subordinates roared angrily. They charged forward without any regard for their own safety, protecting the Heavenly Strategy Region Master. Ji Tianqing did not put the 12 subordinates in his eyes. With a divine hammer in one hand and a divine sword in the other, he attacked with both hands. Swish, swish, swish. Kaboom! Dazzling sword lights flew everywhere. The deafening sound of thunder enveloped the 12 subordinates. Following a series of bang 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 sounds, a few divine kings were struck by the sword lights. Blood splattered everywhere. They screamed in pain as they were sent flying. The other few people had their heads and faces blackened by the thunderbolt. Black smoke rose from their bodies, and they fell to the ground of the ruins. Both sides had only exchanged blows for a short while, but 9 of the subordinates were severely injured. The other 3 were slightly injured. They gritted their teeth and endured their injuries as they stood guard beside the Heavenly Strategy Region Master. Of course, the Heavenly Strategy Region Master was not idle. He found an opportunity to counterattack. Sword lights filled the sky as they pierced toward Ji Tianqing. However, before the sword lights could reach Ji Tianqing, they were blocked by the Primal Chaos Primordial Bell. The Tenjiang-Tal Primordial Bell floated above Ji Tianqing's head. It shone with 5-colored divine light and formed an oval-shaped shield that protected Ji Tianqing. After shattering hundreds of sword lights, the 5-colored light barrier only trembled a few times but did not shatter. The region master of the Heavenly Strategies region was shocked and unconvinced. He still wanted to fight side by side with his 3 trusted aides to continue besieging Ji Tianqing. However, their attacks were easily neutralized by Ji Tianqing. On the contrary, it was Ji Tianqing who unleashed his divine ability that made 3 of his trusted subordinates bleed from their 7 orifices and pass out on the spot. Even the Heavenly Policy Domain Master was wounded by the sword light. Bloody holes appeared on his chest and back. Seeing that the situation was far from good, the Heavenly Policy Region Master panicked and retreated in a panic. Ji Tianqing took the opportunity to pursue and attack. He swung the divine hammer and divine sword with all his might and cast all kinds of spells. The domain master of the Heavenly Strategy Domain was exhausted from defending himself. He was trapped in the whirlpool of sword light and thunderbolts, unable to escape. After just 7 moves, the Heavenly Policy Region Master, who was riddled with wounds, was cut into several pieces by the sword light. Blood splattered everywhere. The broken corpse fell from the sky, and a godhead flew out from the head and fled into the distance in a panic. However, Ji Tianxing was prepared. He raised his sword and slashed it down, cutting the godhead into pieces. Crack! With a crisp cracking sound, the diamond-shaped godhead turned into a dozen pieces and fell from the sky. Just like that, the Heavenly Policy Region Master died before his 12 trusted subordinate. Ji Tianxing waved his hand and shot out a golden light to collect the godhead fragments of the Heavenly Policy Region Master. When he turned his head to look at the surrounding divine kings, he saw the 12 severely injured generals and a few divine kings of foreign races. Their faces were filled with fear. Obviously, everyone had seen the process of him killing the Heavenly Policy Region Master. Not long ago, Dao Xingyun's clone was killed by Ji Tianxing. Now, the Heavenly Policy Region Master was killed as well. Their 2 pillars of support and leader had died one after another under Ji Tianxing's sword. This caused the already low morale of the divine kings to collapse completely. The Region Master is dead. Quick, run. No one knew who shouted. His tone was too anxious and panicked, causing his voice to become shrill. Once this was said, the battle on the battlefield paused for a moment. Many divine kings of foreign races turned to look at the center of the battlefield, looking for the source of the shout. After knowing that the Heavenly Policy Region Master had been killed, everyone's heart skipped a beat. Their faces became panicked, and they immediately lost the will to continue fighting. Many of them only made a few feints before retreating, waiting for an opportunity to escape. Panic and fear were contagious in the crowd, and it spread very quickly. In the blink of an eye, more than 200 divine kings lost their will to fight. All of them tried their best to escape. Swish, 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 swish. Now that things had developed to this stage, no one cared about integrity and dignity. No one cared about the survival of the Heavenly Policy Star or the billions of people. There was only one thought in everyone's mind, and that was to escape as fast as possible and as far as possible. Ji Tianxing and his 9 avatars pursued, taking advantage of the opportunity to kill the fleeing divine kings. More than 200 people split into several groups and fled in different directions. This way, their chances of survival would be higher. However, Ji Tianxing and his 9 avatars also split up, looking as though they would not let anyone go. As countless sword lights and lightning flashed, deafening explosions rang out, and the number of divine kings rapidly decreased. With every breath of time, a few foreign race god kings would be beheaded, their bodies pulverized. The muffled sounds of divine arts clashing and shrill screams echoed through the world. Ji Tianxing and his 9 avatars pursued the divine kings, picking up the quintessence fragments scattered in the sky. After an entire hour, this pursuit that spanned millions of miles finally ended. Not a single one of the 264 divine kings managed to escape. They were all killed. Ji Tianxing took all the quintessence fragments, interspatial rings, and mediocre grade and superior grade king artifact. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Ji Tianxing's main body stopped in a sea of clouds. He took out a divine elixir and consumed it. He silently circulated his divine arts and recovered his divine power. At the same time, his 9 doppelgangers rushed back from all directions. If those avatars did not carry any spoils of war, he could have used a secret technique to make the 9 avatars dissipate millions of miles away. However, each avatar carried a large amount of spoils of war, so they had to meet up with his main body. Very quickly, 45 minutes passed. The 9 avatars returned to Ji Tianxing's side. After handing over their spoils of war, they disappeared one after another. Ji Tianxing kept more than 260 quintessence fragments, interspatial rings, and more than 300 divine artifacts into his interspatial ring. There were too many spoils of war. After leaving Heavenly Policy Planet, he would find time to organize and count them. Currently, after circulating his divine arts and recuperating, he had recovered a lot of his divine power. His mental state was also full. Now, he had to think about how to leave Heavenly Policy Planet. Although Dao Xingyun and the Heavenly Policy Region Master were dead, and more than 200 divine kings of the foreign races were also killed. However, Dao Xingyun's sky-shrouding formation still sealed off the entire Heavenly Policy Planet. There were nearly 10,000 divine sovereigns scattered all over Heavenly Policy Planet guarding more than 300 formations. They still did not know about Dao Xingyun and the Heavenly Policy Region Master's death. If they did not get rid of them, the sky-shrouding formation could still seal off Heavenly Policy Planet for many years. Chapter 40-43. Ji Tianxing stood in the sea of clouds and looked up at the sky. The boundless sky was covered by the five-colored light screen, and he couldn't see the end of it. Ji Tianxing used his God's Eye mystic technique to stare at the five-colored light screen and observe it carefully for a long time. He had to admit that Dao Xingyun's foresight, knowledge, and attainments in array formations were indeed very shocking. Although the five-colored light screen looked like it was only 1 foot thick, the five-colored light screen covered the entire sky. However, the five-colored light screen that enveloped the entire Heavenly Policy Planet was seamless and had no loopholes to speak of. If one wanted to use brute force to attack and destroy the five-colored light screen, no matter how powerful the attack was, it would be dispersed and dissolved by the light screen. In the end, the entire Heavenly Strategy Planet would bear the brunt of the attack. In other words, unless Ji Tianxing could destroy the entire Heavenly Strategy Planet in one move, he would not be able to break the five-colored light screen. Otherwise, no matter how powerful his ultimate skills were, he would not be able to break the five-colored light screen. The more than 300 divine arrays that were scattered all over the Heavenly Strategy Planet were actually able to merge into one seamlessly after they started operating. There were no flaws at all. It was obvious how precise the 300-plus grand formations were. Such a flawless heaven-shrouding array cannot be broken by brute force. I can only find a way to break it. After a long while, Ji Tianxing looked away and muttered to himself with a serious expression. Since he wanted to break the heaven-shrouding array, he had to find a certain divine array and break through a node before finding a way to break it. Ji Tianxing decisively took action. He took out the Supreme-grade King-grade God-slaying battleship and steered it toward the southwest. When he observed the five-colored light screen, he saw the hidden array network in the sky. That was also the path of the divine array's energy flow. One end of that huge array network extended toward the center of the heaven-shrouding array, while the other end extended toward the southwest. Ji Tianxing compared the geographical map of the Heavenly Strategy Planet to that array network and guessed that there must be a divine array at the southwest border of this continent. The God-slaying battleship was extremely fast. It only took 6 hours to cross half of the continent. When the sun set, Ji Tianxing arrived at the southwest border of the continent. This place was a sea of dark green trees that covered the undulating hills, stretching as far as the eye could see. After passing through this sea of trees with a circumference of hundreds of thousands of miles, one would reach the dark golden coastline and see a large stretch of beach. If they continued forward, they would reach the vast sea. Ji Tianxing kept the god-slaughtering battleship and strode across the sky above the forest. He flew into the depths of the forest. As he advanced, he observed the five-colored canopy above his head. Although, on the surface, there was nothing unusual. However, he could see with his divine eye secret technique that the origin of the formation was in the depths of the forest. As it turned out, his judgment was correct. An hour later, he entered the depths of the vast forest and discovered an unusual place. There were two unusual details here. Firstly, this was just an ordinary forest. It wasn't a spirit vein or a holy land for cultivation. However, in this forest that stretched for hundreds of thousands of miles, divine power was abnormally abundant. Secondly, every hill and mountain in the sea of trees was covered by a dense forest, and there were many birds and beasts living in it. Only a few mountain ranges in the depths of the forest, which had a circumference of tens of thousands of miles, were unbelievably quiet. There was no sign of life. Ji Tianxing's intuition told him that this was the location of the formation. As expected, when he used his divine eye secret technique, he discovered that this area was enveloped by an invisible formation. An upper-grade king-level invisible formation sealed off an area with a circumference of 30,000 miles. This made it difficult for anyone who passed by this place to notice anything strange, unable to see any clues. Only a formation Dao expert like Ji Tianxing would be able to find traces of it. Boom! Crack! Ji Tianxing swung the burial of heaven without hesitation and slashed out a 1,000-foot-long sword light with all his might. With a thunderous explosion, countless fragments of divine light burst out from the seemingly empty sky. A huge hole was cut in the invisible divine formation on the spot. The invisible effect was broken, and the situation inside the formation appeared clearly before Ji Tianxing's eyes. The area with a circumference of 30,000 miles, which was supposed to be a mountain range and a sea of trees, had been flattened. There were densely packed gullies on the ground, forming billions of formation patterns that formed a heaven and earth formation. In the middle of the formation, there was a 5-colored altar that was 1,000 feet tall and 10,000 feet wide. 36 divine lords were sitting cross-legged around the altar. There were 3 circles inside and outside, and each of them was sitting in a specific position. These divine lords were concentrating on maintaining the operation of the altar and ensuring the stable operation of the heaven and earth formation. Of course, that tall altar was the eye of the formation that Dao Xingyun had asked him to set up. There were 365 similar array eyes in every corner of the heavenly policy planet that connected so many heaven and earth formations to form the heaven and earth formation. Just as I expected, Ji Tianxing walked through the gap in the invisible formation and swaggered towards the altar. He came from the sky with a dignified and sacred aura, and there was a cold smile on his face. The 36 divine lords who were concentrating on the formation were immediately awakened. When they saw Ji Tianxing's appearance and felt his powerful aura and divine power, they were alert, and their eyes were filled with fear. "Who are you? Why did you trespass into the forbidden area? Do you know that this is a capital offense? Lad, I advise you to retreat immediately. Otherwise, the Region Master will not forgive you. What are you waiting for? Quickly send a message to the commander so that the Region Master will know that someone has trespassed into the forbidden area." Obviously, these 36 divine lords were too lowly and did not know the truth of the matter. Their direct superior was a commander of the Heavenly Policy Divine Abode. With their status, they couldn't even meet the Region Master of Heavenly Strategies, let alone Dao Xingyun. They only knew that they were ordered to guard this forbidden area and not allow anyone to trespass. They did not know the inside story at all. They did not know the effects of this forbidden area, nor did they know who the forbidden area was used to deal with. They also did not know that the Region Master and Dao Xingyun had been killed. Ji Tianxing looked at these divine lords calmly and said, "This has nothing to do with you. If you don't want to die, get lost now." If it was not necessary, he would not kill these lowly lackeys. However, these divine lords did not know how powerful he was, nor did they know his identity and purpose. Not only did none of them escape from the altar, but they all looked furious. They took out their divine weapons and surrounded Ji Tianxing with murderous intent. "Lad, how dare you trespass into the forbidden area and still be so arrogant? Are you tired of living? A foreign race lad dares to behave atrociously on the heavenly policy star. You must be tired of living. Brothers, let's not talk nonsense with this guy. Let's just kill him. As the saying goes, the more people there are, the more courage there is. These divine lords knew that Ji Tianqing was powerful, but they wanted to kill him with their numbers. Amidst the shouting and cursing, the crowd waved their divine weapons and attacked Ji Tianqing. Chapter 40-44. Ignorant people are fearless. Ji Tianqing only had 5 words for the bravery of the 30 divine emperors. When everyone was brandishing their weapons and attacking, he still stood with his hands behind his back and looked calm. He didn't take out any weapon, nor did he cast any spells. He only snorted and released invisible divine soul shockwaves, which formed dozens of invisible swords and stabbed at the divine emperors. Boom! 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 On the surface, nothing happened in the sky. However, the divine lords who were charging forward were suddenly frozen in place. But in fact, every divine emperor's mind seemed to have been struck by lightning, and there was an earth-shattering sound. Then, their minds were destroyed, their divine souls were killed, and their divine heads were shattered. Just like that, 36 divine emperors were killed. Their corpses stayed in the air for a brief moment, then fell to the ground with loud thuds, raising clouds of dust into the air. After killing the divine emperors easily, Ji Tianqing didn't look at the bodies anymore and walked to the top of the altar. Even though no one was maintaining it, the altar was still operating normally and it was shining with colorful light. This heaven and earth array was closely connected to the heavenly strategy planet, and it absorbed endless divine power of heaven and earth and transmitted it to the heaven-shrouding array through the array. Ji Tianqing stood at the top of the altar and performed the secret art of divine eye again. His eyes turned dark gold. He stared at the altar under his feet and the array patterns on the ground around it, and he observed them carefully. After a few breaths, he recognized that it was an upper-grade king-level heaven and earth array. More than 300 upper-grade king-level heaven and earth arrays combined to form an array that surpasses the immortal king level and is half a step away from the emperor level. Dao Xingyun's idea is very clever. It's worth studying and learning. Ji Tianqing murmured to himself and continued to observe the structure of the heaven and earth array. When he held his breath and focused, the array no longer had any disguises and secrets. All the veins, nodes and structures were clearly visible. Ji Tianqing couldn't break half a step away from the emperor-level array with his current power. But an upper-grade king-level divine array was a piece of cake for him. In just half an hour, he had gained a thorough understanding of the heaven and earth grand formation. After pondering for a while, he came up with 2 ways to break the spell. However, he did not directly break the formation. He had to think about another, more important question. It's not difficult to crack this superior king-level heaven-earth formation. I can finish it in an hour. However, what would happen after the formation was broken? Do I still have to travel all over the heavenly policy planet, find all the great arrays one by one, and break them one by one? If he used this clumsy method, he would definitely be able to break the heaven-shrouding formation, but it would take at least 3 months. Ji Tianqing didn't want to waste so much time, so he could only think and find a better solution. The first thing he thought of was to destroy the heaven and earth formation in front of him. After all, this formation was closely connected to the other 300 formations. If it could trigger a chain reaction, it could damage the other formations and cause holes and gaps to appear in the heaven-shrouding formation. However, Ji Tianqing thought about it carefully and felt that this method was not very reliable. It was easy to destroy a heaven and earth formation, but it was a fool's dream to spread the destructive power and affect the other heaven and earth formations. First, the destructive power would be dissipated by the heaven-shrouding formation and distributed to the other 300 formations, which would be withstood by the heavenly policy planet. Second, the destructive power would be greatly damaged and weakened during the process of transmission. Therefore, Ji Tianqing dismissed this idea and continued to think. After a while, he thought of a second solution. extract the world energy of the five elements world and force it into the heaven and earth formation. After destroying a great formation, he could use his mind to control the world energy and destroy the other great formations through the veins of the great formation. However, on second thought, this method was feasible, but it would consume a terrifying amount of world energy. Perhaps the trillions of cultivation resources that he had spent to cultivate the five elements world would be wasted here. Helpless, Ji Tianqing thought of another way. Suddenly, a flash of inspiration flashed through his mind, and he had a new idea. Instilling the world energy into the great formation consumes too much. If this doesn't work, then I'll use the heaven-mending pearl to extract the power of the heaven-shrouding formation. In any case, the heaven-shrouding formation is supported by the world energy. The heaven-mending pearl can extract the world energy to replenish itself and cultivate the five elements world. This method was, of course, the safest. Taking a step back, even if he couldn't successfully destroy the heaven-shrouding formation, it would still be profitable. Ji Tianqing decisively took out the heaven-mending pearl, placed it on the altar, and began to cast the technique. Under his urging, the pearl-sized heaven-mending pearl quickly expanded to the size of a millstone. The heaven-mending pearl lit up with a sacred white light, releasing a terrifying devouring power that enveloped the entire altar. Swoosh! Immediately, the world energy absorbed by the altar rushed into the heaven-mending pearl at an extremely fast speed. The heaven-mending pearl devoured the world energy too quickly, causing a dazzling divine light vortex to appear around the altar. In such a situation, it was like a giant whale opening its bloody mouth to suck up the water in a pond. How could a mere 10,000 feet tall altar withstand the devouring of the heaven-mending pearl? In the blink of an eye, the world energy in the altar was completely devoured by the heaven-mending pearl. The altar sped up its operation, absorbing more world energy to maintain the operation of the formation. However, the speed at which the altar absorbed the world energy was dozens of times slower than the heaven-mending pearl's devouring speed. The altar couldn't support the heaven-mending pearl, so it couldn't support it anymore. It began to shake violently, and cracks appeared on its surface, accelerating its collapse. Boom, boom, boom. As time passed, the altar shook more and more violently, and began to shatter and collapse. In less than 10 breaths, the entire altar fell apart, and the heaven-shrouding formation collapsed. However, the heaven-mending pearl's devouring didn't stop. The terrifying devouring power extended into the sky along the veins of the formation, greedily absorbing the five-colored sky curtain's power. The five-colored sky curtain above Ji Tianqing's head became thinner and dimmer at a speed visible to the naked eye. The power in this area was insufficient, so of course, it had to borrow power from other areas. As a result, the heaven-shrouding formation in other areas accelerated the absorption of the world energy to fill the weakness of the five-colored sky curtain. When Ji Tianqing activated the heaven-mending pearl with all his strength, the devouring power exploded to the limit. The two heaven-shrouding formations closest to him also began to shake violently, accelerating their collapse and collapse. The two heaven-shrouding formations were in the south and west of the continent, and they were also guarded by dozens of Sir-Gods. However, those Sir-Gods were dumbfounded, and they were helpless against this sudden situation. They could only watch as the altar collapsed. The facts proved that Ji Tianqing's plan had succeeded. This was a good start, and it lifted his spirit. He continued to activate the heaven-mending pearl, crazily devouring the world energy. Next, the heaven-shrouding formations scattered all over the heavenly policy continent collapsed one after another. Chapter 40-45. When the heaven and earth divine arrays collapsed, the heaven-mending orb also absorbed a huge amount of heaven and earth divine power. Half of the divine power was purified by the heaven-mending orb and turned into pure energy that was absorbed by the heaven-mending orb. The other half was transferred to the five elements world by the heaven-mending orb, causing a divine power storm to sweep through the five elements world. The citizens of the five elements world were all excited when they saw the five-colored divine light that covered the sky and the five-colored spiritual liquid that filled the sky. The entire world began to expand and all living things grew wildly. Countless birds and beasts gained intelligence and entered a state of cultivation. As for the human martial artists and geniuses, they obtained unimaginable benefits, and their strength and realm increased slightly. Next, as long as they cultivated diligently and absorbed the heaven and earth divine power, their strength would quickly increase. Those martial artists who were stuck in a bottleneck and could not break through in a short period of time also obtained a chance to advance. Without a doubt, after this divine power storm, another batch of divine spirits would appear in the five elements world. Compared to the huge changes in the five elements world, the heaven-mending orb also obtained great benefits, but the changes were not as obvious. It only became more dazzling, and its aura was more complete and restrained. But other than that, there were no obvious changes. As time passed, the heaven-mending orb devoured more and more divine power, and its strength and aura were about to recover to their peak. But recovering to its peak was not the end. The heaven-mending orb's power would continue to increase. Unknowingly, 4 hours passed. Of the 300 or so heaven and earth divine arrays scattered all over the heavenly policy planet, more than 50 had already collapsed. These collapsed altars and heaven and earth divine arrays were not far from each other. Most of them were scattered on the same continent, and a few were at the borders of neighboring continents. The 1,000 or so monarch god experts guarding these arrays were all in a state of shock and confusion. They did not even see the enemy, nor did they know what was going on. After the altars and heaven and earth divine arrays collapsed, they did not know what to do, and could only report the news to their direct superiors and ask for instructions. But only now did they realize that they could not contact their superiors at all. No matter how many communication jade slips they sent out, they could not receive a reply. This situation filled the monarchs with shock and worry, and they had all kinds of bad guesses. Everyone realized that something big must have happened, but no one knew what was going on. For a time, everyone was in a state of panic and unease. The divine lords that were guarding the various arrays were contacting each other and asking about each other's situation. However, after a long discussion, they still couldn't come up with an answer. In short, they were very aggrieved, confused, and panicked. Ji Tianxing was still casting spells, and the heaven-mending pearl was still crazily devouring the divine power of heaven and earth. The five-colored canopy that sealed the heavenly policy planet began to expand from the center, and a slight change occurred. It was visible to the naked eye that the five-colored light curtain in that area had become thinner. The surrounding network of formations that extended out were like bulging blue veins, very conspicuous. After all, they were desperately absorbing the divine power of heaven and earth from other divine formations. But even so, the great heaven-shrouding formation was too big. The speed at which the veins of the great heaven-shrouding formation mobilized divine power was far from being able to keep up with the devouring speed of the heaven-mending pearl. Therefore, the heaven and earth divine formations were still collapsing one after another. Pung pung pung. Rumble. From time to time, loud, muffled booms could be heard from every corner of every continent on heavenly policy planet. Every loud noise represented the collapse and destruction of a heaven and earth divine formation. There were even some divine lords who had slower reactions or were dumber. They tried to stop the collapse of the divine array and cast spells to block it. The result was no surprise. Their divine power was also completely devoured. Even if they sensed that something was wrong and desperately struggled and retreated, they couldn't escape. In the end, they were all devoured by the heaven-mending pearl and died on the spot. Their divine bodies also turned into ashes. Seeing the miserable end of those divine lords, the others didn't dare to go near the altar. They could only watch the altar collapse and the heaven and earth divine formations collapse. Time passed quickly. An entire day passed just like that. The world of 5 elements had obtained an immeasurable amount of divine power of heaven and earth. The divine power storm that enveloped the entire world would continue for a long time. The heaven-mending pearl had also recovered to its peak state, and its power was still increasing. It seemed to have the potential to surpass a king-level divine artifact. Ji Tianqing stopped casting spells and activating the power of the heaven-mending pearl, because the more than 300 heaven and earth divine formations that formed the heaven-shrouding array had all collapsed and been destroyed. Those divine formations were the foundation of the heaven-shrouding array. Since the foundation was destroyed, the heaven-shrouding array no longer existed and was destroyed. The 5-colored light curtain that sealed the heavenly policy planet had already been torn into pieces and turned into billions of divine light fragments that scattered around the world. Such a rare scene was witnessed by billions of people on the heavenly policy planet. Countless people cried out in shock, worry, and confusion. No one could answer them. However, their worries and concerns were not unfounded. After a short while, an unexpected disaster swept across the entire heavenly policy planet. Previously, the heaven-shrouding array had sealed the entire heavenly policy planet and used more than half of the divine power of heaven and earth on the planet. Now that the heaven-shrouding array had collapsed and more than half of the divine power of heaven and earth had been sucked away by the heaven-mending pearl, the heavenly policy planet had returned to its normal state. The result was obvious. The heavenly policy star's spatial barrier began to crumble. Countless cracks appeared, and densely packed gaps appeared. There were also violent vibrations between heaven and earth. The earth shook, jumped, and trembled, causing a terrifying earthquake. Several continents shook violently. The sky also began to collapse and crack. Countless spatial cracks appeared, and a large patch of pitch-black void appeared. Rumble, bam, bam, bam. The eruption of a super-earthquake caused a series of chain reactions. Several continents were faced with tsunamis that blotted out the sky. The continental plates were also shattered. Vast mountains and rivers collapsed and shattered. Lava and volcanoes erupted violently from the planet's core, blotting out the sky. The space barrier shattered and the sky collapsed. Naturally, it was eroded by the void. A large patch of darkness began to appear in the sky above the heavenly policy planet. Boundless spatial storms surged into the heavenly strategy planet, wreaking havoc and destroying everything in their path. Such a terrifying disaster was equivalent to a natural disaster. If the heavenly policy region lord and a few hundred divine kings were still alive, they could still resist and resolve it. However, those divine kings were all dead. There were less than 30 divine kings left on the heavenly policy planet. In the face of such a terrifying disaster, they were also helpless. They could only watch helplessly as a few continents shattered, as countless divine kingdoms collapsed and were destroyed. Tens of thousands of cities were destroyed by the void storms and the blazing divine fire. Chapter 40-46. Mountains and rivers were destroyed, homes were destroyed, and billions of alien life forms died in blood and fire, turning into ashes. That tragic scene played out everywhere on the heavenly strategy planet. Even though Ji Tianqing had left the heavenly strategy planet and was in the void, he still couldn't bear to see the tragic scene. He could even hear faint screams and roars coming from the various continents. No one could calculate the casualties on the heavenly strategy planet for the time being. However, Ji Tianqing had observed more than half of the heavenly strategy planet. He could roughly estimate the result from the damage done to a few continents. There were hundreds of billions of alien life forms on the heavenly strategy planet. In this calamity, at least 80% of them were affected. Of these 80% of living beings, 70 to 80% were injured. The number of deaths should be no less than 30%. A rough estimate put the number of deaths on the heavenly strategy planet at more than 20 billion. Obviously, this could no longer be described as a disaster. It should be called a calamity. However, who could be blamed for this? On the surface, Ji Tianxing was the main culprit. If he hadn't destroyed the heaven-shrouding formation, this calamity wouldn't have happened. However, he was also a victim. He had only destroyed the heaven-shrouding formation to protect himself and escape. The real culprits were Dao Xingyun, the heavenly strategy region lord, and the few hundred alien god-kings. Looking at the tragic state of the heavenly strategy planet, Ji Tianxing muttered to himself, when he set up the heaven-shrouding formation, Dao Xingyun had already made plans and preparations. Even if he had to destroy the entire heavenly strategy planet, he would still kill me. Although I killed his clone and ruined his plan, I also triggered a calamity and caused the heavenly strategy planet to be plunged into misery and suffering. If Dao Xingyun knew about this result, he probably wouldn't be sad about the loss of the heavenly strategy planet. He would only be angry and regretful that he couldn't kill me. Such a tragic calamity will definitely alarm the heavenly Dao and send down its wrath, right? Thinking up to this point, Ji Tianxing looked up into the void and thought to himself, although I was forced to defend and only attack to protect myself, I still have a lot to do with this. However, I'm still involved in this huge karma. I should be punished by the heavens, right? According to past experience, even if the heavenly tribulation were to descend, it would only descend after the calamity was over. Thus, Ji Tianxing observed the heavenly policy star's movements and waited for the disaster to end. The flow of time seemed to have slowed down. Only half a day had passed, yet it felt so long. 12 hours later, the chaotic and calamitous heavenly policy planet gradually calmed down. Regardless of whether it was the shattered spatial barrier, the collapsed sky, or the collapsed earth, everything was gradually restored under the restoration of the heavenly Tao. Seeing that the disaster was over, the non-humankind beings, who had just experienced blood, fire, suffering, and death, all cheered excitedly, as if they had just survived the disaster. However, the sadness and heavy atmosphere still overshadowed the joy and excitement of surviving. Even though the disaster was over, the heavenly strategy planet was still in ruins. Countless souls had perished, and blood flowed like rivers. The living people still had to treat the injured, settle the dead, and rebuild their homes and countries in the future. Of course, this was a long-term matter, so it would not be mentioned for now. In the dark and cold void, seeing that the calamity had finally subsided, Ji Tianxing raised his head and looked into the depths of the void, quietly waiting for the wrath of heaven to come. As expected, the heavenly Tao was furious. In the depths of the vast and boundless void, a dazzling blood-red light lit up, as if a raging fire was burning a prairie for thousands of miles. Amidst the blood-red light, there were billions of lightning bolts flashing and deafening thunder roaring. This was a sign of the heavenly Tao's anger. The blood-red light and billions of lightning proved the words, furious. One could imagine how angry the heavenly Tao was. Ji Tianxing felt the mighty heavenly might, and his pupils constricted. He could not help but tighten his grip on the burial of heaven's sword and divine hammer. He also activated the power of the indestructible golden body and the primordial chaos bell to the extreme. The wrath of the heavenly Tao naturally could not be avoided or resisted. Since he could not avoid it, he could only resist and resolve it with all his might. However, when the blood-red light surged and billions of lightning bolts formed red lightning pillars and bombarded him, he realized that something was wrong. Those tens of thousands of red lightning pillars were all bombarding the heavenly policy planet. Ji Tianxing, who was 200 million miles away from the blood-red light, seemed to have been forgotten and ignored. Not a single bolt of lightning or a single streak of bloody light struck him. This, Ji Tianxing immediately frowned with a puzzled look on his face. He did not understand. He should be one of the two people with the greatest karma and could be considered half of the culprit. Why didn't the heavenly Tao punish him? As for the tens of thousands of red lightning pillars that landed on the heavenly policy planet, they also scattered and landed everywhere. Those who were hit by the wrath of the heavenly Tao and the red lightning pillars were the 100 or so divine kings who ran away and the divine king overlords guarding a few continents. It was as if the heavenly Tao was angrily rebuking them. As overlords and guardians of the heavenly policy planet, you didn't save them and caused the deaths of billions of people. You should be severely punished. Not only were the divine kings who were struck by lightning and struck by the heavenly Tao dumbfounded, even Ji Tianqing was a bit dumbfounded. How did this happen? Ji Tianqing muttered to himself. Then, an idea flashed across his mind as he thought of a possibility. Maybe this is just the first punishment of the heavenly Tao, just an appetizer. Let's punish those divine kings first. Next, the heavenly Tao will send down an even more terrifying punishment to punish me and Dao Xingyun. Thinking of this possibility, Ji Tianqing did not dare to let his guard down and continued to be vigilant. On the continents of the heavenly policy planet, the muffled sound of thunder sounded one after another. Those divine kings who were struck by lightning were already severely injured and were very weak. Now that they were being punished by the heavenly Tao, their fates were even more tragic. Almost 80% of the divine kings were killed by the heavenly Tao divine lightning on the spot and turned into ashes. Only about 20% of the divine kings were lucky enough to survive, but their injuries were extremely terrible and they were on the verge of death. The punishment of the heavenly Tao soon ended and the heavenly policy planet returned to normal. At this moment, Ji Tianqing looked at the bloody light with a serious expression. He had also accumulated his divine power to the maximum and was ready to attack. He thought that it should be his turn now. Unexpectedly, the bloody light gradually dissipated, and the billions of lightning bolts surging in the bloody light also quickly disappeared. After a short 10 breaths, the strange phenomenon in the void dissipated. The void returned to its usual darkness and coldness, as if nothing had happened. The heavenly Tao's punishment ended just like that? The heavenly Tao actually didn't punish me? Ji Tianqing revealed a stunned expression. He only felt that it was incomprehensible and unbelievable. Even if he did not take the initiative to take action and cause the deaths of billions of living beings, he was still passively involved and indirectly created this calamity. The heavenly Tao actually did not punish him for such a huge karma? This did not make sense. It was fine if it did not punish him, but Dao Xingyun was the real culprit, a person who had committed the most heinous crimes, but the heavenly Tao actually did not punish him. What kind of logic was this? Chapter 40-47. Ji Tianqing felt that it was inconceivable and unreasonable. However, he definitely could not reason with the heavenly Tao, nor could he. The will of the heavenly Tao was so mysterious and hard to fathom. Ji Tianqing stood in the void for a moment and heaved a sigh of relief when he saw that the void was completely quiet and that the heavenly Tao had no intention of getting angry again. It looks like the heavenly Tao will not punish me and Dao Xingyun. Why is that so? What are the criteria and basis for the judgment of the heavenly punishment? Ji Tianqing frowned and pondered, but he could not figure out this question. Thus, he took out the god-slaying battleship and drove it into the depths of the void, planning to slowly think along the way. The heavenly policy star was still in turmoil and would take a long time to truly calm down. However, all of this had nothing to do with Ji Tianqing. He still had many things to deal with. Not only did he have to count the spoils of war, but he also had to refine the godhead fragments of the many god kings and absorb the memories of the heavenly policy region lord's divine soul. The god-slaying battleship flew at a moderate speed in the void. Ji Tianqing sat cross-legged in the cockpit, looking like he was resting with his eyes closed. As he controlled the god-slaying battleship, he took a king-level divine pill to recover his divine power. Previously, when he fought with Dao Xingyun and a few hundred god kings, he did not seem to be affected, but in fact, he had expended a lot of energy. Now, he could finally calm down and properly recuperate. Time passed quietly. 2 days later, Ji Tianxing took a divine pill and circulated his energy to recuperate. His mental state was obviously much better. At this time, he had also guessed the reason and answer after much thinking and deduction. Above the God-King realm, the so-called last step is to grasp the power of the heavenly Tao and interfere with the rules of the heavenly Tao. In that case, people like Dao Xingyun and the other 4 God Emperors are all top experts who can influence the will of the heavenly Tao. Thus, they can avoid the punishment of the heavenly Tao and not be punished by the heavens. However, I have not grasped the power of the heavenly Tao, nor have I reached the God Emperor realm. How can I be like them and avoid the punishment of the heavenly Tao? In the past, everyone and I performed meritorious deeds of saving the world. They were all rewarded by the heavenly Tao and obtained the power of merit, but I didn't. Now, it seems that the heavenly Tao will neither reward me nor punish me. It should have completely ignored me? Or perhaps, I used the heaven punishment array to come back from the dead and jumped out of the scope of the heavenly Tao's rules? Even though Ji Tianxing's tone was probing and uncertain, he didn't seem to be sure. However, the more he thought about it, the more he felt that this answer was closest to the truth. Of course, whether this was the truth or not, at least he had proven one thing. The heavenly Tao would not reward him, but it would not restrict or punish him either. This made him feel even more confident and at ease. He gradually put aside this question, no longer thinking about it and feeling distressed. He began to sort out the spoils of war he had obtained from this battle. Firstly, there was the silver dragon divine spear and a spatial ring left behind after Dao Xingyun's avatar was destroyed. The silver dragon divine spear was a supreme-grade king-level divine artifact, and it was personally refined by Dao Xingyun. There was no doubt about it. Ji Tianxing used the power of the 9 heavens divine cauldron and the divine hammer to forcefully erase the imprint and soul aura on the silver dragon divine spear, completely severing its relationship with Dao Xingyun and becoming an ownerless treasure. Then, he entered the distorted spacetime and gave this supreme-grade king-level divine spear to Ji Ku. Ku, you've always used the divine spear as a weapon, so you can unleash greater combat strength. The divine spear I refined for you previously was only a medium-grade king-level divine artifact, so it will limit your combat strength in the future. This silver dragon divine spear is for you. It's enough for you to use forever. Refine it well. Ji Ku was naturally pleasantly surprised and excited. She wanted to decline, but she knew that Ji Tianxing was sincerely giving it to her, and no one was more suitable than her for this divine spear. So she accepted it. Ji Tianxing left the distorted spacetime and went to check the interspatial ring of Dao Xingyun's incarnation. The interspatial ring worn by the incarnation was far inferior to that of Dao Xingyun's original body. The resources and wealth stored in it were also incomparable. Even so, Ji Tianxing found 2 trillion worth of cultivation resources from the interspatial ring. There were also dozens of medium-grade and high-grade king-level divine artifacts, thousands of king-level divine pills, and some strange divine items. Ji Tianxing put all these cultivation resources and divine artifacts into his own interspatial ring and put them away in different categories. They might be of use in the future. Then, he continued to check the interspatial rings of the Heavenly Strategy Region Master and the 300 or so foreign race Divine Kings. In comparison, these interspatial rings were even poorer and shabbier. They could not be compared to Dao Xingyun's interspatial ring. Other than the interspatial ring of the Heavenly Strategy Region Master, there were also cultivation resources worth a few trillion, as well as a batch of priceless divine artifacts and pills. In the interspatial rings of the few hundred foreign race divine kings, there were usually only tens or hundreds of billions worth of resources. However, wealth had always been something that could be accumulated from small amounts to a large amount. In the interspatial ring of a foreign race divine king, there were only a few 100 billion worth of resources. The amount of resources and wealth accumulated in the 300 or so interspatial rings was very shocking. Ji Tianxing made a rough estimate. A conservative estimate would be around 200 trillion, which would be 200 trillion after conversion. Originally, he had planned to pick out some king-level resources and divine artifacts and leave them in his interspatial ring. The rest would be absorbed by the Five Elements world. However, the Five Elements world had already benefited greatly. The divine power storm was still ongoing. Even if he invested 200 trillion worth of resources, it would only be icing on the cake. Therefore, Ji Tianxing stored these cultivation resources in his interspatial ring first. He would distribute them later. It was worth mentioning that he only had one interspatial ring in the past. Ever since he saved more than 10 stars and picked up a large number of star fragments and crystals, the interspatial ring was almost full. Now that he had obtained so many resources, he could only refine a high-grade king-level interspatial ring to store resources and treasures. Therefore, he wore the interspatial ring on both his index fingers. Fortunately, these two interspatial rings were as black as ink. They were simple and unadorned. They did not look funny. It was already 3 days later when he finished counting the spoils of war. At this time, the god-slaying battleship flew past a waste star. Therefore, Ji Tianxing piloted the god-slaying battleship and landed on the waste star. He hid in a remote area of the waste star and took out the Jiutian 10 Absolutes pagoda. He entered the distorted spacetime to refine the quintessence fragment. After the battle on the heavenly strategy planet, he had accumulated 400 quintessence fragments of divine kings. The first thing he wanted to refine was naturally the quintessence fragment of the Heavenly Strategy Region Master. Not only was the Heavenly Strategy Region Master the strongest, but he also wanted to extract the memories of the Heavenly Strategy Region Master to investigate clues related to the Heaven-Sealing Dragon Emperor. Chapter 40-48. In the distorted spacetime, under the blood flame sacred tree, Ji Tianxing sat cross-legged, circulating his energy to refine the quintessence fragment of the Heavenly Strategy Region Master. Not far from him, Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Ji Wushuang, and Ji Wuhan were circulating their energy to heal their injuries and cultivate. On the other platforms under the sacred tree, Chao Qingyu, Yank, and the others were circulating their energy to heal their injuries. Those who had participated in the battle on the Heavenly Strategy Star were all severely injured. Fortunately, the Sword of Burial of Heaven and Ji Ku had protected them and prevented them from dying at the critical moment. Although their injuries were quite serious and required a long time to heal, it would take them a few decades to 100 years. However, after experiencing that battle, they had gained a lot of combat experience and their foundation of the divine Tao was more stable. Every expert had to go through the tempering of blood and fire before they could truly grow. They had the most suitable cultivation illusory realms and the most abundant cultivation resources. They also had many companions to discuss and verify their cultivation path. They even had a top expert like Ji Tianxing to protect them. In addition, they had been tempered by the battles of the God Kings. Under such circumstances, how could they not work hard and improve their strength rapidly? Unknowingly, the god-slaying battleship had sailed in the void for an entire day. 50 days had passed in the distorted spacetime. Ji Tianxing had already refined the quintessence fragment of the Heavenly Strategy Region Master and absorbed his memories. After sorting out the Heavenly Strategy Region Master's memories, he obtained the information he wanted. However, he felt a little regretful that the Heavenly Strategy Region Master had never heard of or seen the Heavenly Strategy Dragon Emperor. In the past 1,000 years, a few major events had happened in the Heavenly Strategy Star region, and they were all related to peak God Kings. However, none of them were related to the Heavenly Strategy Dragon Emperor. In short, the disappearance and death of the Heavenly Strategy Star region definitely had nothing to do with the Heavenly Strategy Star region. In addition to this information, Ji Tianxing also learned many secrets about the heavenly strategy star region and Dao Xingyun. For example, how did Dao Xingyun subdue the heavenly policy domain lord and support him to firmly control the entire starfield? Another example was the situation of the many stars in the heavenly strategy star field, and how the non-human beings in the entire star field worked and pledged their loyalty to Dao Xingyun. As for Dao Xingyun, the mystery of the Grey Mist, and the other 4 god emperors, the heavenly strategy region master's status was too low to know. After refining the heavenly strategy domain lord's godhead fragment, Ji Tianxing temporarily stopped cultivating. He had to carefully consider this issue and make a decision as soon as possible. The 5 god emperors all know that I have been reborn and have regained the strength of a peak god king. They also know my path forward. Therefore, Dao Xingyun had set up an ambush in the heavenly policy star field a few months in advance. The other god emperors would definitely be prepared for the next few star field. They would definitely not sit still and wait for death. Most likely, like Dao Xingyun, they would gather hundreds of god kings in advance and set up an ambush, waiting for me to step into the trap. In the near future, Ji Tianxing's strength did not increase or break through significantly. If another battle similar to the battle on the heavenly policy star occurred, he would still not be able to defeat his opponent alone. He would still need the help of Yunyao, Jiku, and the others. As for Yunyao, Jiku, and the others, they were still in a severely injured state and were still recuperating in the distorted spacetime. Ji Tianxing knew that now was not the time to head to the next star field. If he rushed there rashly, he would most likely have to fight alone, and his life would be in great danger. After all, the god emperors were not weak. They all had powerful strength and method. Even if he could deal with one god emperor's clone, he would not be able to deal with hundreds of god kings. Even if Yunyao, Jiku, and the others recovered from their injuries and assisted him in the battle, the other god emperors might very well join forces to set up an ambush. If 2 god emperors' clones joined forces and hundreds of god kings from other races helped, there was a high chance that he, Yunyao, and the others would be killed. With this in mind, Ji Tianxing decided to temporarily avoid the brunt of the attack and plan for the long term. He wanted to bring everyone to a safe place where they could recuperate and improve their strength in peace. When everyone was fully prepared, he would act according to the circumstances. At first, Ji Tianxing wanted to leave the heavenly policy star field and find a place to hide in the vast void. However, when he looked into the dark and cold void, he suddenly saw a bright golden sun in the depths of the distant void. It was an incomparably huge golden star. It floated alone in the void, emitting an endless sacred golden light that illuminated the various star fields. Ji Tianxing was stunned for a moment before he reacted and recognized that golden star. He immediately revealed a look of relief, and a smile appeared on his face. That's one of the eternal stars, the divine realm. Back then, when he set off from the dragon realm, he crossed the void and crossed one star field after another. When he was about to reach the heavenly policy star field, he was already more than halfway there. The heavenly policy star field and the heavenly leader star field were very close to the divine realm. He already knew this when he was still a Kenshin. However, he had always been thinking about exploring the 9 star fields and finding the mystery of his master's death, so he did not pay attention to the divine realm. Now that he saw the divine realm again, he immediately had an idea. Why should he find a place to recuperate in the void? If he returned directly to the divine realm, not only would he be able to recuperate in peace, but he would also be able to deal with many matters. For example, he could destroy the foundations of the 5 god emperors' forces and gather the old subordinates and remaining forces. The 5 god emperors' bases were in the divine realm, and they each controlled 5 continents. They also left many trusted experts to help them guard their bases. However, the 5 god emperors' true bodies were deep in the void, studying the mystery of the gray fog. Their clones must be lying in ambush in the heavenly crane, Heavenly Phoenix, and other star fields, waiting for Ji Tianxing to walk right into their trap. As such, the divine realm was naturally empty. At the very least, the God Kings and Peak God Kings guarding the divine realm would definitely not be able to withstand Ji Tianxing's attacks. After making up his mind, Ji Tianxing left the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes Tower and appeared in the cockpit of the God-slaying battleship. He sat cross-legged on the disc array and controlled the God-slaying battleship to change direction and fly toward the divine realm. At the same time, he took out a large number of divine pills and elixirs to heal his injuries and cultivate. Although the divine realm could be seen clearly from the heavenly policy star field, it seemed as if the distance between the two was not far. In reality, the distance between the two was more than 100 billion miles. Even with the God-slaying battleship speed, it took half a year to reach the vicinity of the divine realm. Only when he was close could he feel the majesty and vastness of this eternal star. This eternal star with a diameter of 10 billion miles was completely enveloped by a golden barrier. It was the strongest spatial barrier in the world. No matter how terrifying the meteorites were, they would not be able to destroy its protective layer. Unless the heavenly Tao collapsed or an extraordinary power destroyed it, this star would be eternal and indestructible. Ji Tianxing was filled with anticipation and hope as he drove the God-slaying battleship straight toward the Divine Realm's golden barrier. Divine Realm, I'm back. When I left the Divine Realm, I was chased by many God Kings and was forced to flee to the Dragon Realm. This time, not only will I avenge my past humiliation, but I will also turn the Divine Realm upside down. Chapter 40-49. Swoosh. The God-slaying battleship passed through the golden light barrier and entered the God Realm. Amidst the flickering light, the God-slaying battleship entered the God Realm. The blue sky and clear water appeared in front of Ji Tianxing. Although he did not know which continent was in front of him for the time being. But after more than 20 years, seeing the scenery of the God Realm again, he still felt somewhat emotional. In his previous life and this life, after the experience of 2 lifetimes, he had been calm and peaceful in the Dragon Realm, and it was smooth sailing. Only in the God Realm did he experience so many ups and downs, and this time when he returned to the God Realm, he would never be like before, and he would not let the tragedy repeat itself. He never forgot that when he fled the boundless heaven continent back then, those ancient clans that secretly helped him were still waiting for his triumphant return. The Jiang clan that would never be an ungrateful person. The War God clan that was hot-blooded and forthright, waiting for him to spar and fight. And the Lan clan that had deep brotherly love. And the 100 Refinement Ancient sect that was waiting to exchange the 100 Refinement Divine Hammer blueprint with him. Swoosh! Ji Tianxing was full of confidence and anticipation as he steered the God-slaying battleship across the sky, heading straight ahead. There were endless mountain ranges all around, covered with lush forests. One could clearly hear the sounds of many birds and beasts. The God-slaying battleship turned into a stream of light, flying across the sky with lightning speed, 10,000 miles in an instant. An hour later, the God-slaying battleship flew out of the vast mountain range and forest, and finally saw a certain city of the God Race Nation. Ji Tianxing kept the battleship and entered the city alone, asking around for information. After asking around, he found out that this was Surging Sun City, the territory of True Sun Divine Nation and Qianfeng Empire, belonging to the Maple Water region, the territory of the Boundless Heaven continent. This answer made Ji Tianxing even more emotional, revealing a trace of a complicated smile. When I ascended to the God Realm back then, I appeared in the Boundless Heaven continent. After so many years, I returned to the God Realm again, and it's actually the Boundless Heaven continent again. Fate is really strange. He could only think that perhaps this coincidence was the will of the heavens. Since he landed in the Boundless Heaven continent, then he would pick up his old path and sweep through the entire God Realm from the Boundless Heaven continent. Of course, he was not in a hurry to destroy the forces of the 5 god emperors. Ji Tianxing needed to find a safe place to recuperate and cultivate in seclusion for a period of time. It just so happened that the Maple Water region he was in was located in the center of the Boundless Heaven continent. Ancient clans from several grotto heavens in the surrounding regions had helped him when he escaped from the Boundless Heaven continent. As for the reason, it was naturally because he had shown great kindness to those ancient clans in the past. Ji Tianxing steered the god-slaying battleship and flew east for half a day. He left the Maple Water territory and entered the Raging Flame territory. It took him a while to find Yen Su's paradise. This cave was located in the center of the Raging Flame territory. It was hidden deep inside a primitive forest and a mountain range. Almost no one had ever set foot here. The entrance to the grotto heaven was invisible and sealed. Without the guidance of the people from Yenshu's grotto heaven, no one from the outside would be able to find it. Ji Tianxing also spent some effort to find this place. After all, he had been to Yenshu's cave before and stayed there for about half a month. The ancient clan that occupied Yenshu's cave was called the Nangong clan. It was an ancient clan that had inherited the legacy of the ancient times. More than 1,000 years ago, Kenshin was asked by a friend to come to Yenshu's cave to help the Nangong clan. At that time, the Nangong clan was in trouble, but they were unable to solve it. Kenshin's arrival gave some of the clansmen hope. However, there was another half of the clansmen who did not have confidence in him and treated him as a swindler. There was even a part of the clansmen who wanted to banish him from Yenshu's cave. Kenshin used his own methods and abilities to convince those who opposed him, ostracized him, and wanted to banish him. Then, he used his superior wisdom and methods to solve the crisis of the Nangong clan and helped the Nangong clan to overcome the crisis. At that time, the entire Nangong clan was shocked. Half of the Boundless Heaven continent knew about the news and felt it was unbelievable. From then on, the Nangong clan had formed a deep friendship with him. The clan leader of the Nangong clan even deliberately tested Kenshin and wanted to marry his daughter to Kenshin, even as a concubine. In this way, not only could he thank Kenshin for saving his life, but he could also deepen his relationship with Kenshin. After all, the daughter of the clan leader of the Nangong clan had also developed feelings for Kenshin after a few days of contact. However, Kenshin rejected the Nangong clan's good intentions. After staying in Yenshu's cave for more than 10 days, he left. Previously, Ji Tianxing was chased by the experts under the Azura God Emperor in the Boundless Heaven continent. He thought that he would not be able to escape. He did not expect that at the last moment there were many ancient clans that secretly helped him. The Nangong clan of Yenshu's cave was among them. At that time, Ji Tianxing was also surprised. He did not expect the Nangong clan to still remember the kindness of the past. This time, when he returned to the Boundless Heaven continent, he chose to go to Yenshu's cave for 2 reasons. Firstly, Yenshu's cave was the closest. Secondly, he trusted the Nangong clan. The entrance of Yenshu's cave was protected by a king-level divine formation. It was in an invisible state. Dozens of God Lord Realm guards, led by 2 God King experts, guarded the entrance firmly. Ji Tianxing landed in the sky above a large canyon. He waved his palm and shot out a few divine golden lights, which landed in the canyon. Bam bam bam! Following a few muffled sounds, the canyon lit up with a dazzling divine power radiance. A formation plate with a radius of 10 miles appeared. On the colorful formation plate, there were hundreds of millions of formation veins and dozens of guards. In the middle of the formation plate, there was a blazing white light door that was 100 feet tall. It was in a closed state. Originally, the dozens of guards and the 2 commanders were resting. Suddenly being attacked, the formation was activated. Everyone was startled awake and subconsciously gripped their divine weapons tightly. Everyone's gaze gathered on Ji Tianxing, who was in midair. Ji Tianxing did not dodge either. He showed himself openly and flew toward the 5-colored formation plate. When he arrived at the edge of the formation plate, the two God King Realm Guard commanders shouted in unison, "Who are you? Why are you trespassing into Yenshu's cave?" For the past few hundred years, Yenshu's cave had been in a closed state. The disciples of the Nangong clan would not come out if they did not encounter any major issues. This was the order of the Nangong clan head. It was also some kind of wisdom. Currently, it was to avoid disaster. Because the Nangong clan head spent decades of effort to divine and deduce a trace of heaven's secret. He had a premonition that the boundless heaven continent would have a huge turmoil. Because of this, no one would come to Yenshu's cave for decades. Suddenly, a white-robed youth appeared. Without saying a word, he directly cast a spell to activate the defensive formation. The guards were of course alert and full of vigilance. Fortunately, Ji Tianqing appeared very magnanimous and did not have any sneaky appearance. He looked at everyone with a calm expression and reported his name and purpose of coming. When the two guard commanders heard, they were immediately stunned. Chapter 40-50. Kenshin's name reverberated like thunder in one's ears. As the publicly acknowledged #1 expert in the divine world and the youngest peak divine king, his life could be said to be legendary. It was no exaggeration to say that thousands of years ago, many cultivators and deities idolized him and imitated him. Almost 70 to 80% of the cultivators who were born 1,000 years ago had heard of his name and knew of his deed. Even ordinary people were like this, let alone the Nangong clan who had received his favor and even seen his true appearance. It was not hard to imagine how the dozens of guards and the two guard commanders would feel and react when they heard that the sword god Long Tian was here to visit the Nangong family's patriarch. Everyone was stunned on the spot and looked at Ji Tianqing with their mouths agape. They only reacted after a few seconds of hesitation. You just said, you are Kenshin? The red-haired middle-aged guard commander on the left asked with a stutter. Are you really Kenshin? The guard commander on the right with black wings was emotional as he stared at Ji Tianqing with his bright eyes. The dozens of guards were even more so. All of them widened their eyes and stared at Ji Tianqing with bated breath. That blazing gaze was like that of a fanatic worshipper who had seen his idol. Everyone's hearts were in their mouths as they waited for Ji Tianqing's reply. They were afraid that he would deny it or say no. Although it was hard for everyone to believe that Kenshin, who was equivalent to a legend, would suddenly visit Yenshu Grotto Heaven. However, everyone was looking forward to it, afraid that it was a misunderstanding or a farce. The two guard commanders had a serious expression as they reminded Ji Tianqing in a serious tone, "You should know that Kenshin is now a wanted criminal in the boundless heaven continent, a criminal with a huge reward. If you impersonate him, don't blame us for capturing you and handing you over to the territorial master." Obviously, the two guard commanders were not blinded by the surprise and did not want this to turn into a farce. Under everyone's gaze, Ji Tianqing nodded calmly and said, "I am Kenshin Long Tian, the real deal. Quickly report to your clan master." After receiving his affirmative answer and seeing his calm expression, unfathomable aura, and smooth aura, many of the guards instantly believed half of it. In their hearts and fantasies, a peerless genius and expert should have such a bearing and demeanor. Therefore, one guard commander nodded and said, "Please wait for a moment, we will report to our clan master now." After he finished speaking, the guard commander took out a communication jade slip and reported the news to the Nangong clan patriarch. Of course, he repeated Ji Tianqing's description and words to the clan master. After the announcement, everyone fell silent. What followed next was a quiet wait. Although many of the guards were excited, many of them were looking at Ji Tianqing curiously, whispering to each other in secret. However, before confirming Ji Tianqing's identity, no one came up to him or tried to curry favor with him. Even if these people worshipped Kenshin, the Kenshin was a legend from 1,000 years ago. He had disappeared without a trace in the last 1,000 years. Even if the Kenshin's name had spread across the boundless heaven continent a few decades ago, it was still news of him being surrounded by many experts and forced to flee in all directions. Most importantly, the boundless heaven continent was now under the control of Emperor Shura. The experts under Emperor Shura's command viewed Kenshin as the #1 criminal. These guards did not dare show too much affection and worship, lest they cause trouble for the Nangong clan. After all, the Nangong clan had closed their paradise and not left it or entered the world for more than 200 years in order to hide from disaster. Since no one took the initiative to speak, Ji Tianxing also remained silent and waited quietly. Normally, the Nangong clan patriarch should have replied in half an hour. But after waiting for half an hour, there was still no news from the Nangong clan patriarch. There was no movement at all. Therefore, Ji Tianxing frowned in puzzlement. The 2 guard commanders and the many guards also began to mutter in their hearts. They began to make guesses and discuss through sound transmission. What's going on? Why is there no news from the patriarch even now? The patriarch achieved great success half a month ago and came out of seclusion not long ago. He can't be cultivating in seclusion again, can he? Could this Kenshin be a fake? The patriarch knows that something is wrong and is gathering the experts of the clan? It's very likely. I think the patriarch is gathering the elders to discuss countermeasures. If this Kenshin is a fake, should we make a move and capture him first? Don't be rash. Even if he's a fake Kenshin, he's still a real God King expert. If we act rashly, we won't have the advantage. Right, you calm down, better wait for the patriarch's orders. The many guards discussed through sound transmission in secret. Their gazes when looking at Ji Tianxing also gradually became vigilance and suspicion. Right at this time, the white light door that had been closed all along suddenly opened from the inside. Swoosh! Amidst the flickering white light, a middle-aged divine race man who was over 10 feet tall and had a stalwart build stepped out of the light door. This person was dressed in a blue brocade robe and wore a luxurious crown on his head. His entire body emitted the dignified aura of a superior. His face was dignified, square face, wide nose, and a wisp of beard on his lower jaw. His thick brows and big eyes looked rather refreshing. When the guards around the white light door saw this middle-aged man appear, they all bowed and saluted in unison, saying in unison, "Greetings to the patriarch." Without a doubt, this majestic blue-robed man with a majestic gait was precisely the Nangong clan's patriarch. He ignored the surrounding guards. After stepping out of the light door, his gaze landed on Ji Tianxing, sizing him up carefully. When he saw Ji Tianxing's appearance clearly and sensed Ji Tianxing's aura, he immediately revealed a joyful smile. However, before he could greet Ji Tianxing, those guards still maintained their saluting posture. At this time, the light door flickered with white light again and several figures appeared. One after another, middle-aged and elderly divine race men dressed in brocade robes with dignified and graceful appearances appeared on the disc array one after another. When the guards saw these God King experts, they still maintained their saluting posture and shouted in unison, "Greetings to the elders." Clearly, those 7 middle-aged and elderly God Kings were the Nangong clan's elders. No one would have thought that the Nangong clan's patriarch did not reply for so long, not because he suspected that Kenshin was an impostor. Instead, he had gathered the elders and personally came to the Grotto Heaven's entrance to welcome Kenshin. Understanding this point, the blood of the guards boiled with excitement. Their emotions were agitated to the extreme. All of their guesses and suspicions vanished into thin air at this moment. Everyone's eyes, when looking at Ji Tianxing, recovered their passion and adoration. At the same time, the Nangong clan's patriarch suppressed his agitated emotions and quickly walked in front of Ji Tianxing. He cupped his hands and saluted him. "Kenshin, long time no see. We've finally waited for your return."